Okay, so picking up where I left off there, my name is Lee. I'm the facilitator today. My pronouns are he and him. I'm an ally within the movement, greater total. I get to facilitate an outstanding session today with some very intelligent, thoughtful change makers within the larger community of knowledge mobilization. This is onboring knowledge mobilization, and here's hoping that's exactly what it is. We're going to do our best to make this fluent, as easy as possible to understand, to participate. Of course, the chat box is open. I'll do my best to monitor that throughout. And I'm going to give a quick idea of exactly what this is going to look like before we get into the proceedings. Ideally, we have 3 speakers outside of myself facilitating, one of which I know has a previous engagement that they do have to get to after their segment of the presentation. So other than otherwise static presentations, there's going to be, of course, the intro, which we're going through as we speak. I will introduce speaker 1 and do a brief Q&A that's a bit more interactive with them before they have to participate. And maybe then we're going to go to a quick break to give everyone an opportunity to stretch the legs and settle in for a long afternoon. Once we reconvene, we'll have speakers 2 and 3 and a Q&A that includes them both. And then we'll go through a bit of a recap and conclusion. And of course, a thank you to all those who participated as well. So before we get started, I think it's only appropriate. I know that right now, when we talk about the larger sectors involved in social justice, housing and homelessness specifically, we focus a lot on needs for such pieces as an urban and rural Indigenous housing strategy and Indigenous populations and First Nations people being involved more effectively in conversations and being given the appropriate platforms to share their knowledge. And I think that they are an interesting piece of this conversation because historically, it seems through research, Indigenous populations are spectacularly effective at knowledge mobilization by looking at it from a different lens than we do. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But before I do, I'm coming to you today from the beautiful Atlantic province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Therefore, I was just listening to our colleague from Australia. It's 2:39 p.m. my time, so I'll be wrapping up just about 6 o'clock almost by the time we wrap up today here where I am. And I'm sure for many of you, it's different time zones. Speaking with throughout this whole process, I know it's about a 4-hour difference. And for all of you who are giving your time today, whether it be out of personal interest or professional courtesy, we're very grateful that you could join us. That said, my land acknowledgement will come from where I'm facilitating from today. It says that we respectfully acknowledge the land which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has now been erased forever here in Newfoundland and Labrador. We also acknowledge the island of the Uktahumguk as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional ancestral homelands of the Innu and Nitisianan, the Inuit of Nutusavik and the Inuit of Nututkavuk. We recognize all First Nations peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, the 7 generations to come. As First Nation people have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. This was lifted directly from the fine folks at First Light in Newfoundland who do tremendous work here in my neck of the woods. I definitely encourage you to check them out. They've put together tremendous guides for people like myself who want to participate in effectively and ceremoniously facilitate sessions of this nature. So we're going to be covering a lot of topics today. I know that we have, as I mentioned, some great speakers, and I'll get to them and give some background on them in just a moment. But as I'm doing that, I want to first explain that Elaine made it very clear when selecting me for this process that my job is to make this as awesome as possible. So I'm going to do my best to do that, and in doing so, that'll mean yielding as much of my time as possible because we have enough cisgendered white men of privilege who are use their podiums regularly, and I'm not the expert today. I'm merely just the person who's helping to facilitate the conversation. However, that said, I will be watching the chat room and engaging conversation for participants and doing my best to make sure that your questions are answered or that you have an opportunity to ask them and phrase them as you so will wish. I know that's going to be creating presentations that include, data of lived members for infographics. There's going to be conversations about integration. There's going to be a lot of great data that comes from this. So I'd encourage you, if you have to step away, That's totally okay. We definitely understand, but we do encourage you to try to absorb as much of this useful information as possible, because it's dynamic, and dynamic is important in the static age of the post-COVID-19, or in some places current COVID-19 pandemic, and where we're all sitting together but apart on our computer screens. I know that some of these webinars can become very inundating and a bit overwhelming and very difficult to sift through. As interactive and cool as it is that we got more knowledge to our fingertips and we're mobilizing knowledge as we speak, the other end of it is that it's also very simple to come, to be affected with compassion fatigue, for example. So what I would encourage folks to do today, if you need to take a moment to step away, please do, but please feel free to come back. We will make sure that you're readmitted, and we would encourage you to participate as much as possible and gain as much as you can from these very valuable experts. So as it's been noted, the session will be recorded for those who are unable to take us. My dog is saying hello. It doesn't seem to matter what professional setting we're in here in the COVID era. I think a lot of us are surrounded by our furry child loved ones. I have a cat asleep beside me on the table who doesn't care about my workspace. So if any of the speakers or myself, you happen to see an animal in the background, please bear with us. It just seems to be that they understand that they rule the house, and we are merely just patrons within their palaces. So with that in mind, here's a few pieces that are important for knowledge mobilization. Most postdoctorate jobs are required to include an understanding of how to implement knowledge mobilization, how knowledge mobilization was done, and is not the only way to do it. So with that in mind, we also have to recognize that that's not just postdoctorate jobs. So it can be a scenario where those who are in the most professional setting and have spent significant time owning their practice, learning their craft, and delving deeply into issues that matter are actually not the only ones who are affected by this. As someone currently without a degree, I've been asked about knowledge mobilization and asked how agencies can better effectively make sure that their information is being shared and disseminated and affecting as many people as possible. We have to grapple with, what does knowledge mobilization even mean? For LivEx folks specifically, does this even represent our experiences? Historically, we've been taught, or at least many times has been the common practice, not to talk about research until it's done, but we know that weaponizing knowledge mobilization in real time is crucial to creating and nurturing meaningful activism. I know there was a somewhat of, I guess all we can do is joke at this particular time, although it's no laughing matter, because every time we turn on the news, we see to the south of us some of the very scary policy that's being reenacted. And no doubt there's never been a better time for activism and boots on the streets. And as someone who grew up in the Joe Strummer era of listening to my favorite punk rock bands try my best to inspire me in this process, I think that any opportunity we have to understand how to create meaningful activism by nurturing different elements of knowledge mobilization, by weaponizing it in effective, peaceful, thoughtful, effective ways, I think those are things that we definitely need to focus on. For folks with lived experience, we know the responsibility of sharing knowledge that impacts people's lives. And many times it definitely feels irresponsible to sit on life-changing crucial data for a 4-year period throughout the study. Now, there are benefits to social mobilization that are important to consider: building social capital and creating social change being two of the fundamental ingredients. But what we should also think about it, and I mentioned this just in the prelude, is how might we think about it from an Indigenous perspective. The idea of hoarding information and knowledge is very elitist in many respects. And the idea of being able to do so over a significant amount of time and almost for the sake of competing to some degree. If I'm focusing on my research studies with tools that have been made available to me through some level of fluency in society, and I am then sitting on that information for an extended period of time, that's categorically the opposite of how Indigenous peoples have been so effective at mobilizing knowledge through their traditions, through their study, through their culture, and through their dissemination of information and knowledge as a community. And it's something we should definitely keep in mind when having this discussion today. The truth is knowledge many times is predatory. It's not just how, but why. It's the idea of nonconformist and open access that we need to focus on, because the last thing we want to do is make it so that people who are above others in social hierarchies and food chains are the ones who have all of the information and knowledge to make the crucial decisions without involving those who many times are impacted and affected, much like LivEx folks. So today, each speaker is going to get a certain amount of time, and we're going to make sure that we maximize that. You've heard more than enough from me. I think I've been speaking for the better part of 11 minutes, and hopefully that's about as much as you'll hear from me today, other than the direct aspects of the conversation. I'm going to just minimize my box here just for a second, because I want to make sure that I do this effectively and bring up everybody's information as best I can. I see that we have 3 speakers today. One of them is going to be doing the first speaker is Dr. Eric Weissman, who's been developing and applying a lived experience form of scholarship to the study of homelessness, housing, mental health, and substance use in Canadian and US cities since 1999. Eric is the principal investigator on a multi-sited study of post-secondary student homelessness across Canada. He is an assistant professor at the University of New Brunswick and Making the Shift board member. As well, we also have, we're going to have a session on infographics by Kimberly Langille and research posters by Leigh Bursey. I know there's a lot more to this session than I'm even getting to right now, but I think it'd be appropriate, considering Eric's time restraints, that we give him the opportunity to take over from here and kickstart this process, and we will continue the discussion as we go along. So that said, Eric, the floor is yours, and if you need me, please just feel free to reach out and let me know, and I'll do my best to steer this as I go along. I thank you all for your time today, and I hope you enjoy this session as much as I hope that I will as well.
Thanks, Leigh. It's a pretty, this is a pretty familiar group, so I'm actually going to change the way I present, if that's okay. You guys know I'm pretty conversational. Let me share my screen with you. And I actually have about a half hour more than I had planned on, because the meetings were pushed back. But so what I've done is I put together, I'm just gonna do it this way. Can you guys see these PowerPoints? Yeah? No? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. I'm just gonna, some of these you've seen before. What I really decided that I was going to do for this chat today, and now seeing how we're so familiar with each other, I'm going to run through some that you've seen, but I really felt that instead of, I'm going to focus on some of the ways that I use translate visual experience, or sorry, lived experience through visual technology, because I think most of you know that that's my primary methodology. But I want to talk about some of the risks that are associated with doing lived experience scholarship, things that I've come to learn. Some of them are based on very private conversations with some pretty prominent lived experience scholars who are friends of mine. So I want to sort of reiterate what is on the sort of additive side of our work, and then look at what happens when it comes out the other end. So I hope that's okay. And I'm just, I made these PowerPoints available as a PDF, but if you want, I can also send you the PowerPoints if you want to use them. They're the kind of thing that, if you're teaching a class or you have students or you want to share with your friends. I mean, they're pretty casual. Most of you understand what I do and why I do it, but I've given some thought to the risks that are involved in lived experience scholarship. And I never really thought about it that much. So when we mobilize lived experience, there are inherent risks that we've taken that I want to be more explicit about. So my land acknowledgement is that I would like to acknowledge this presentation and much of my current work taking place on the traditional territories of the Wabanaki. The Wabanaki include the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, and Penobscot. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. And I'd also like to thank all the people that I've worked with and written about and participated with. I've been really blessed as a person in recovery to have met thousands of people on the streets and in different places and in different stages of decline and recovery. And I don't know, I guess the one thing that the reason that I have such faith in lived experience, and I've always been attracted to the writings of ethnographers who use their own lived experience in different situations, is that the people that I've met because of my lived experience prove that I wasn't really a failure in the social world. In fact, that the social world wasn't this clean white place. I come from a place of privilege. Other than being, Jewish and hearing, and my family didn't go through the Holocaust, but other than hearing the terrible tales of how our people were persecuted for hundreds of years and relatives of mine murdered in Russia, and the reason we came to Canada was to avoid that kind of persecution. Other than that, I came from a place of privilege, and the kinds of people that ended up being homeless in my world weren't people who came from my world, and there I was in that situation, and so I had a very difficult time reconciling who I had become, and to me everything makes sense years later, and I could never make sense of why I dropped the ball. I know that sounds silly, but it'll make sense in a minute. So I was really blessed to work with some amazing people who I never thought I would establish loving friendships with as a researcher or just as a member of the community. People I used to laugh at when I was out, doing things, people who became really good friends of mine when I started my work in Tent City. So what's a lived experience scholar? I'm a 61-year-old lived experience scholar, and I can tell you that you guys, I've seen this picture before. I think the picture on top is me when I entered my MA, and then the picture on the bottom is like 4 years later, completely addicted to cocaine, having lost most of the bones in my jaw. And you can see just how I lost 38 pounds and had drugged myself out of my PhD and one of the most amazing, potentially amazing careers anyone could ever imagine. I was a really good student, and I was in sociology at U of T, and I taught and did all this research about the things I was becoming, which is really strange, just to me, the nature of it, and I use the word addictions because based on the DSM-5, I have severe substance use disorder, which they would call addiction, and there's no pretty way to put it. I was pretty much addicted to either physiologically or behaviorally to pretty much every substance we had back then. So long story short, because it's not really about me, I was pretty close to dying, and like weeks away from dying, when through a strange coincidence, which by the way is where I'm writing a memoir now. And it starts with this incident where my sister found me waiting to be murdered, quite frankly. And I've told you guys that story before. So I ended up getting into rehab. And when I was in rehab and I was homeless again, I had nowhere to go because I had nowhere to live. And I had to confront the fact that I was literally homeless. And if I didn't stay in this transitional experience, this long-term experience, I was likely not to find housing. And if I had left early, as was my inclination, I didn't want to be around all these people. If I had left early, I would have ended up on the streets again. And I would, this is it's not a scientific thing to say, but knowing who I was and what I was, I OD'd on snorting heroin about a month earlier, so I was pretty much guaranteed death if I went out again. So I stayed. And by the time, the only way I could manage staying, and I didn't think of it this way then, but it's the earliest cultivation of lived experience that I could, in my life, I started writing about the place where the recovery home where I was staying was called Buena Vista on the Rito. And I started writing about all the people who were there. I was always a writer, and I started writing basically a journal, but a short story about a guy who loses his housing and how difficult that is, and the psyche of a young Canadian, in a time of relative prosperity, to lose everything. And what does home mean? And what does housing mean? And I wrote about the people I was rooming with and the conversations we had. And I didn't really think of it. I had a couple of 3 degrees behind me, but I didn't think of it that way. But when I left, and I was able, just so you guys understand, to me, it's important. Currently, I'm a very, I think most of you know, I'm a really strong proponent of harm reduction, and I believe in safe supply and safe consumption. And I had an argument with my neighbor the other day. She completely disagrees with that, and she said, well, why can't people? I think people need to be sober like you. And I said, well, I personally, I would love for people to have the opportunity to not be tied to a drug if they could find a way to do that. But the opportunities that I had, people don't have anymore. So the reason I say that is that I had a government that paid, by the way, I'm looking at you on this screen, and this is my camera, so I apologize. I had an opportunity to go to rehab, completely paid for up to 2 years. And I even had a monthly stipend when I was in this rehab. And when I got home, there was welfare back then was closer to $900 a month. So, I mean, it was, and I had a family. See, I was lucky. I had a family that stuck by me and was able to support me. And I had a doctor, you know, I had a medical doctor who specialized in addictions. And so I call these the constellation of events around me were very different than things are in the last 20 years facing people who had the same problems I had. So I'm a pragmatist, and I cultivate lived experience to come up with using a form of pragmatic ethnography that I'm going to talk about, which kind of looks at how do we address the issues facing people, not in ideal terms, but in terms that are concrete, that can yield actual results. That I'm pragmatic about things. And if lessening the harm is what we have to do while we discover and develop ways to eliminate harm, if we can, then that's what we've got to do. So I started incorporating my own lived experience into a form of ethnovideography, because when I was away, I was talking conversations with a couple of scholars that I knew, because even when I was early in recovery, I felt really crappy about dropping out of my PhD twice because of addiction. And it was suggested that I read certain books that had just come out, and some came out later than others. So I've shown you guys these books before. And so I was writing about my life in this tiny home community, in this recovery home. And when I left, I was still writing about homelessness. And I got to Toronto, and Toronto had close to 7,000 people on the streets for the first time in its history. I mean, that's the, if you were to ask people doing street work, that's what the numbers they would say. The city said officially there were 2,950 people. Now, these are people either accessing shelters or literally homeless, right? So that's a figure that cities are still hesitant to, any city is still hesitant to discuss. There were so many people on the streets that, and I was living in downtown in Cabbagetown, which is a sort of, has a lot of social housing and a lot of rooming houses at the time. So I got to know all kinds of people, and people who I had known before I got sober. When I came back, first of all, they all thought I had ratted out all my friends because I disappeared for close to 2 years. And they thought that I had, I don't know, gone into witness protection, because apparently there were a lot of drug busts in Toronto while I was gone. And it was pretty funny having to explain to them where I was, you know, and it was amazing. It started, you know, I just started talking to people and writing about it. And I said, you know, I one day these people took me to this to Tent City. Does anybody remember what Tent City is? Anybody remember Tent City in Toronto?
No, I've never been to Toronto.
I do.
So, okay, I'm sorry, who said I do? I didn't see, I couldn't see.
Linda.
Hi, Linda. So
I used to live in Toronto during that time.
So yeah, so I'll ask you, what was your take on Tent City? What did you know about it?
At the time, basically, it was kind of the offshoots from the shelter system. An encampment that kind of was set up because there was the lack of the housing, and there's a lot of police persecution. And if I remember it correctly, it was Mel Lastman, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Mel.
It was Mel. The mayor was going after them as well. It was the idea of cleaning up and people kind of were thought of as the garbage and addicts and the undesirables, right? That wouldn't work. So the idea was always kind of cleaning them up, and then the advocates were fighting for the fact there wasn't enough housing and enough social supports. Right. And I think it was around the time welfare was cut.
It was like directly after that. So everything you said is absolutely accurate. And in fact, when they were evicted, so first they were seen as this noble kind of housing action, and a lot of important people who I think are really like important Canadians in terms of activism, like Kathy Crow and Barrick German, all the folks from the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee, you know, they fought for this community, and it became this really wild community, and it was literally like a Wild West town. It sort of grew out of control, and the reason I mention it is that. A lot of the people I was working with on the streets of Toronto at the time, I was writing stories, I was shooting a video, I was supposed to be taking character studies for a musical that people wanted to make. There's a theater company out of LA that wanted to do a musical about homelessness. And I know that sounds bizarre. I don't know if I've told you guys this before. I'll put it in the chat. This wasn't the project, but this was in 1999, 2000. And I collected all kinds of amazing stories on these little video cameras, because and people would interview themselves. I wasn't doing it for any reason except to collect stories. And then September 11th happened, and the company cut all of its international business. And I had all this footage. So I said to them, let's make a movie. Look at all this cool footage we have. And we started interacting with each other over the footage. And this is something I'd never thought of before, but we started making a film with each other instead of me making a film about them. And this is important for what I'm going to talk about today. So to me, the authorship of this work is represented in so when we mobilize information, the authorship is present. It's impossible to distill information that doesn't really include the participants in a way that's going to be taken genuinely, right? So when we talk about lived experience in this context, it starts off with our personal interests, which is what this ethnographic self as resource talks about, right? We talk about our experience, why we ask the questions we ask, why we see things the way we do. But to me, it's super important to sort of capture this learning process about how our own epistemologies and our own sense of lived experience, our memory of the lived experience of trauma and things like that change. And the more we're in contact with people who share similar lived experiences. And I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I hope it does. So from Tent City, they were evicted, and then they got housing because the same city that kicked them was appalled by the tiny homes down there, was equally appalled by the inhumane way that they were evicted. So the city introduced rent supplements, and they got housing. Sorry, I'm closing my window because somebody's mowing. And then I said to my friends, I said, you know what? This film isn't finished. You guys are all getting housing. We gotta, this is what's cool. This is really the amazing story. And they said, yeah, let's come on into my house, check it out. And their lives were changing and their lived experience was shifting. And so the question in my mind, in fact, one of the film links I'm going to give you shows you my later academic treatment of this problem, which is how do we, lived experience is not static. And the reason I have Fabian's time in the other here is that anthropologists have always, they deal in lived experience as social anthropologists, cultural anthropologists. For 120 years, they've been going into communities, distant communities, and writing about them as snapshots in time. And some of them, if they're lucky, go back and revisit, and you see that lived experience actually changes. And it's different than the kind of authorship we can do today because we have so many dynamic tools that they didn't have. But for me, the question was, I wouldn't see somebody for a couple of months, and after 2 months of being in housing, they were like a different person. And so the fact that we were able to work together over 12 years using cameras and revisiting footage allowed us to do this really, in my opinion, really ethical work. So I made this film, and I wanted to go back to school. And so what I want to focus on today are the kinds of things, if you're a lived experience scholar, that we need to kind of address if we want to mobilize our work in academic and public frames. So, sorry, there's a chat there. So here, I went back, I applied in 2008, and 2007 and 8, the film was picked up by the Royal Ontario Museum, and it was used in a really cool exhibition on homelessness in Toronto. It was called, oh my God, House Paint Phase 2. Is anybody familiar with that project? They brought in graffiti artists from all over the world, and they built these replica, they call them shanties, so replica shanties, and all the different facets of the shanties, the faces, the roofs were painted beautifully, and each piece, so each wall, each piece of the ceiling, they were auctioned off to raise money for Habitat for Humanity. And my video played as a sort of, for people to look at. And so with that in hand, I decided, you know what, I'm going to go revisit the possibility of finishing my dissertation. I feel I have something to say. And I went to York, for example, and I went to U of T, and I had all these meetings, and I introduced myself as someone with lived experience. And I'm laughing because they would look at me with this, like a puppy dog does when they don't understand what you're doing. And they had no idea how that could be converted into a form of scholarship. They knew what autoethnography was, but one of the questions they asked me is why, we're not specifically interested in examining our own societies, our own cultures. Now, I was applying to programs in culture and communication, sociology and cultural geography, and I found that kind of difficult. But I realized that at the time there was a real positivist movement. This was, don't forget, 2008, 2005, and there was a real need to start measuring things better, to start seeing the dimensions of the problems in Cartesian terms. And when I talk about Cartesian anxieties, this is the major split between interpretivists and lived experience scholarship. Really is a kind of interpretive approach to me. It sort of defies the quantitative. It can be converted into, but I don't think it can't start with that. And so a lot of the universities, especially the research-oriented departments, have this, this isn't my expression, a Cartesian anxiety. The idea that if you can't measure it, then how are you going to judge it and how are you going to change it? So Descartes said that things can be counted, measured, and compared. And so to apply an interpretivist method is considered legitimate, but very difficult for someone to do who hasn't been in school for 18 years. So I was turned down for 3 years by different universities until I found one called Concordia, and they had a special individualized programs. And the fact that most universities saw my unconventional lifestyle as saying that I couldn't mobilize my lived experience, like really, who's going to trust somebody who failed from 2 PhDs because of addiction? How are they going to think that I can turn that experience actually into tools, into not only a qualitative database of experiences, but knowledge that's useful in different settings, right? And then I found that most of them were very resistant to that at that time. But Concordia wasn't. They looked at the film, they looked at my life story, and said, look, we got a program for people like you. So I went, and they said, they actually were, instead of closing off opportunities, they were about what we call positive openings, right? I said to the folks at these universities that had rejected me that they really better start focusing on lived experience, because there are so many social problems that are growing at exponential levels that the majority of our great heroes in social sciences especially are people who have had a lived experience, that I found their resistance to someone trying to reinvent themselves based on their lived experience a little bit confusing. And so how do you make sense of, so this is where the mobilization of lived experience happens first. When you're trying to get into school or get a job, as a person with lived experience, you may not think of it this way, but you have to mobilize your experience. And that means you sort of have to rationalize it into ways that a potential hirer or a potential university program, for example, will find palpable. And it was really difficult. It's not that difficult anymore. In fact, now, as I'm going to talk about later, there are programs. Almost every university, every post-secondary institution has a requirement to pay attention to different lived experiences. And one of the things that I heard when I was at York, for example, and at U of T, was that they had no reason to expect that I would actually finish what I started, just so you know. And I think looking at the past record, again, which is a Cartesian anxiety, because the positivists in the world want to look at our past behavior as if it's an indicator of what our future behavior will be. And I feel like saying to them, well, I don't want to look at your past behavior. I'm afraid what I would find. I'm sure there are, I always feel like saying, haven't you had struggles that you've overcome? Okay, so one of the questions for me and the work that we do is, how do you measure basically life when it's not static, right? So there was this expression when I was a kid, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, which is it references the Trojan horse. Some invitations are extended to you and me because we add color, because we sometimes, especially in some schools, they have certain quotas. In our own departments recently, we've done a lot of hiring, and there was real pressure to hire people from specific groups. And which is important because many groups are underrepresented. But when they hired me, I said they actually hired me because I'm not fall into the very popular groups. I'm an older white cis guy, but I have a lot of lived experience, and I'm very open, as you can tell. So, and I work at a very small university, so they hired me on. I was really lucky that they hired me based on some unique qualities that I had. But I also wanted to make sure that they were hiring because they genuinely believed in me. I didn't want to be just around, right? So, and I don't think that most of us with lived experience are hired that way. But one of the things that was always pointed out to me, and one of the criticisms people used to give was, yeah, but how, if you're so unique, is that why they hired you? Shouldn't you conform in some way? And I said, well, I do. I have my PhD, I'm published, I have all these other experiences, right? So your lived experience, this is important. And I don't know if you want to write this down, but our lived experience is not just our unique lived experience, but the things we share with people, right? Like in trying to mobilize knowledge gained from lived experience, you don't want to point out the differences all the time. You want to point out how people who might have particularly tragic or traumatic pasts, like ourselves or the people we work with, people for whom social justice and inclusion are matters of great concern, are similar in so many ways that they that they deserve inherent consideration. And so even though we can measure lived experience in a number of different ways, usually through qualitative measures, there's a great pressure to measure our own experience when we're looking for work or when we're trying to get into a program, and to rationalize the research we want to do in terms that other people can understand. And because they don't actually, because most people can faced with making those kinds of decisions, have so many decisions to make, they kind of want to see everything reduced down into numbers or into statistics, or and all of this is valuable as part of the work that we do, but it's really takes some of the flavor, the compelling elements of lived experience out of the equation. So I think it's a good thing, but it's important to stick very closely to the fact that there is an emerging truth, and that ambiguity really defines the world. Even for people who have it made and have billions of dollars, there's ambiguity. But in our lives, especially those of us who have suffered addictions, homelessness, and other traumas and assaults, that ambiguity is actually something we come to live with. I mean, I find confusion and I find struggle and conflict more normal than I do quiet and calm. I bought a house 2 years ago. I never had a house before, and I now live in a very small community, and it's quiet and it's calm, and I never thought that this was possible. And there are times when I just have to get out of here and do something crazy because I don't know. I don't know if it's good for me or not, but I feel that in fact there are a number of different me's. So when I'm one of the problems that positivism has with lived experience, especially when we're trying to mobilize it and convince people of certain ideas, is that it's so ambiguous to them, right? Unless we can put it into terms that are easily translatable, it's often rejected. Now, I've included a link here of a little film that some of you have seen, and it's about it's about Brian, who I met in Tent City, looking back at the research we had done together and how things have changed. And if we have, I don't know, do we have time to show it? There's an 8-minute version and do we want to show it or just want to see it later? I can tell you the main gists of it. Anybody want to comment? Leigh, you're the boss.
No comment at this point, boss. You're doing great. Keep going.
Do you want me to show the little film clip, or I'll show another one?
Yeah. Please feel free to, whatever enriches your presentation.
Well, I'll show it once we get through these other. I don't want to take this too much. Well, you know me, I talk a lot. Let's get through and I'll show it if I can, because it speaks to method. So all right, here we are. So to me, there's a bunch of risks in doing the work we do. And I think everything, first of all, I like edgy work. I do edgy work. And maybe it's because that it's safer for me to do so, because of, I'm basically a white man. I understand that. But, I also feel that there are a great many people who say things that need to be said and are not down for it. And so when I'm marking papers or I have students doing a dissertation, I want them to push the envelope. It doesn't matter who they are. And I'm there to support them. So when we are subjecting our work and our research to larger funders or investigating bodies, when we have to speak to the like SHRC or NSHRC or CIHR, when we have to do an R.A.P.P, we very often have to conform we have to conform the ambiguous into terms that they can anticipate in terms of liability, or that we can rationalize into a budget system, you know, as if it's going to, as if the tasks that we need to take to somehow understand this really ambiguous situation better is actually doable. I mean, it's just, this is what B.S.W called, he said it's really unethical like this to be stuck to these foundations, philosophically speaking, because the only ethical moment is the one where the researcher or the person maintains a fidelity to the emerging moment, and he said in a moment of crisis, right? So, and he was speaking mostly to what political ethics should look like. But in the same sense, I've always believed that the only way that we can do ethical research is by maintaining this fidelity to these, what we also call in sociology, the longue durée, which means things that actually take place over time. So when in Tent City, for example, the reason my friends wanted to make this film was they were sick and tired of being on the news and having these little snippets of their lives being illustrated to the world as their lives, as if that was it. This is what Fabian said in that in Time and the Other, that, you know, when we do research and we go into a community and we do a study and present it as if that's the situation, we completely separate that from its beginning and its where it's going as soon as we leave the situation, right? So we have to somehow recognize that there are always, everything we represent is in the past. And so one of the questions for me methodologically, especially when it comes to lived experience with people who are still alive and whose lives are in flux, how do we convey that message? And for me, obviously, as we're going to see, it's mostly been through video. I also have a thing about cleansing. Like, I do a lot of interviews. We have a project I'm on. Actually, Jillian's here. She's in on this project. And this year, a couple of MTS members will be. We're going to be asking MTS to participate in the second phase. So this project on student homelessness, right? We have a lot of interviews and focus groups that we're doing, and we have to, on the one hand, we have to look at do a lot of thematic analysis, a lot of content analysis, and that's important for us to find some general themes and ideas that we can put into a report. But I want a number of my research assistants, and I personally want us to go through the stories, reading them hand by hand and making physical notes, and then talking about what we read, what we got out of it. Because to me, the richness of lived experience is not the stuff we can measure. It's very often the stuff that we would cleanse away. It's an unusual comment that doesn't seem to make sense. Like those are the lacuna that I'm, of investigation that I want to go down, right? That's what I did in my dissertation. I kind of said, well, here's all the basic stuff, but now let's follow the stuff that doesn't make sense. Let's follow the stuff that I can't really measure. So I'm not preferring any one method over another. In a second, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But in some cases we need, in mobilizing our information, we need to speak again to the public. We need to speak to funders. We need to speak to agencies, planners, nonprofits. We also need to speak to ourselves, and most importantly, we need to speak with the people and to the people that we're doing the work with. So in some cases, we're going to be mobilizing our knowledge by gathering through interviews and surveys and maybe recordings. I don't know what that is. Somebody's mowing my lawn, and I don't have anyone who mows my lawn, so that's freaking me out. Sorry. Wow. Where was I? Right. So sometimes we have to produce data that is that we can extrapolate from, and that is upstreamable. And then sometimes we want to produce stories, and sometimes we want to explore these deeply moving narratives, because they're often more compelling. I mean, it's rare that I see statistics that I get chills from, but there are often quotes and stories that shake me to my bones and make me interested in something. So there's a hybridization that's important. So the first risk is, to me, that if you're stuck on creating neat narratives out of messy ones, you're going to lose something. So that to me, there isn't a neat way or there isn't one neat way to represent a lived experience. The other problem for me, and especially lately, is some people have an unrelenting idealism. And we are all about social justice. Some of us have different views about what it means or how to achieve it. But what we really want to do is you don't want to reject other positions. And when you're in the field working with people who might be looking at the same social problem with a different lens, you don't want to fight about it. Like, some people think we need to eliminate the system and get a brand new system. Some people think we need to increase access to the system. And then some of us understand that, in fact, they're two sides of the same coin. And so you want to constantly be building bridges. And what I never want to do is use somebody's story to get my own point of view across. If I'm using somebody else's story, then I need to get their point of view across. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not. It should. My lived experience, I'm free to do what I want with. But when I'm working with people, because of my lived experience, because it's a bridge into their lives, because they trust me and want to talk to me because of, I don't judge anyone, and because I can talk back with them, not to them. When I use that story as the arms for my own salvo into somebody else's point of view, unless they want me to do that, that's a bit of an issue. So it's one thing to have a debate, but when we speak publicly and use somebody's story to try and convince other people, and the story wasn't intended for that way, I have an issue with that. You can't do it. By the way, you can't do it when you're publishing an article. I mean, there are times, just recently, we've had people who were in a project of ours who asked to be taken out of a film project because the site had changed so dramatically that they didn't want their story attached with it anymore. So it's important. Like, we have our ideals, we have our own personal point of view about what social justice means. But what we really want to do is bring people together with this work. Even people of different points of view are still people we can have connections with. They're still people who can be part of the work. We can be part of their work. And you know what? Over time, things can merge, right? I think that the clash between different paradigms and different visions of social justice is sometimes unproductive. All right, so don't compromise your values, but be open to change. Like, be open, like I said earlier, positive openings. In my opinion, it's always important. And if you're confronted in the field, or if you're confronted in your own deliberations, if you're writing a piece and you're confronted by a conundrum that you're not sure that you agree with, that disagreement in your own mind should be included in the discussion. You should be mobilizing the discontentment that some of your research has led to, or what they call in grammatology, an aporia, where you reach a point where you can no longer explain you can no longer explain why certain things have been excluded, right? So for me, my method is called pragmatic ethnography. And what I was doing in my dissertation was asking people what it is that it takes to make them become activists, what it takes for people living in tiny shanty towns with no resources, with a high degree of addictions. What is it what does it take? How do they see the world? How would they change it? And what's getting in the way of their ability to remain social activists in the war for housing, right? Because it's a war. This was in Portland, Oregon, right? And there were a lot of people who really didn't buy into the method that I was getting at. They were going, well, how can you know what's inside people's heads? And I said, well, I'm not going to know what's inside their heads. What I'm going to do is live there, and I'm going to try and figure out who's active and who's not active, and then try to find the reasons for them either forming or not forming critical attachments to ideas. It's so ambiguous and so vague that most people didn't really quite understand what it meant. And then I got people involved in just talking about justice and what social justice meant. And we have these incredible discussions. So there is another risk, which is when you present this information, some people might find it light. Some people might find it, especially like I have colleagues who are very rich in quantitative skills, and they might not take it as seriously. But the real risk is when you take contentious information that you've learned in the field and you put it out there, there's either going to be little attention or scholarly respect for the work, or you might get too much and you might become a superstar. And it might only last for a week, or it might last for a few years. I I have a very good friend whose work was very well received, but it was a total distraction because it was so well received. And then people ended up resenting them. This is really important, you guys. There are people who resent us because our lived scholarship is no longer baggage. It's our own personal baggage, but our lived scholarship is actually a resource. And so there are people in academia and out there in the world who would like to dismiss us as people who, again, are engaging in forms of trauma porn or poverty porn. I mean, the idea that we can use bad and difficult experiences to profit from them. I have so many problems with that I can't even begin. And it's also, I'll tell you something else, it's strangling me a bit. I have this memoir I'm supposed to be finishing, and my story is incredibly dark. And I feel that just the first chapter that I wrote is I really wasn't that familiar with trauma porn until a couple of friends of mine who have written really great works suffered from it in the last couple of years. And I'm scared to write this. I'm scared to write this. Are people going to think that that's what my lived experience stories are all about? And are they going to think that when I work with people with different lived experiences and I gather their work together, are they going to think that of the work that I do? So to me, that's a bit of a risk. So I would say never do the work to become a superstar. As long as you're doing the work that is totally important to get the best knowledge you can from lived experience, then you will get the results that you're supposed to get. Yeah, you may get results like I did that completely changed your point of view about it. When I went to Dignity Village to do my research, I thought it was the greatest place on earth, and then I left early because it ended up being at the time a very troubled and horrible place. Everything I had theorized tiny home villages at that time to be because of it were not. So the other thing is that when you compromise your work, whether you see it or not right away, you'll see it down the road. The inherent compromises will become apparent to you, and there's a real feeling of, oh my God, I shouldn't have done that, and you don't want to do that. The other thing that I have, I'll just glance over this quickly. I think we need to use software, especially when we have 250 interviews or so that we're going to have for this one survey. This one study that we're doing, and you need software to help you analyze all the potential data that comes out of there. But I really think that before we start using, for example, NVivo or other software systems, we should be doing it by hand. Like I make all my students do take segments of film interviews and code them by hand, and then we compare them. And I think that's important because I just know for a fact that when you code things manually, especially in a group situation, you see things differently. I did. We analyzed 90,000 global articles for a study on immigration and refugee status in the 5 top newspapers in the world. It was for somebody else's project, and we had to do it by hand. We had codes. We had to read every article. We had to code each article. It took like 2 years, but the results were phenomenal. So I think that the software is really important for us, but I think we need to understand what the software is doing. I also think that there's an intimate recollection. So measures and themes are really important, but being able to talk about the stories in vivid detail and with passion is what makes your lived experience meaningful when you're mobilizing it. Yeah, it's funny you say that. I have access to the software. I just don't. I don't like the software. So what I do now is I usually have RAs coding interviews and focus groups using software, but then I go and look at the transcripts myself and make sure that the software is somewhat accurate. The point for me is that if you do it by hand and you've read the stories, when you talk about it publicly, when you go to pitch the idea, when you're trying to rationalize the importance of lived experience or what it means to the work you're doing into the field or to changing the lives of people, if you know the story when you talk, I'm getting goosebumps now, you will be able to speak with conviction. Whereas recounting data it's really important to people who need to hear data, but the rest of the world, they're open to emotions. Like the kind of stuff we're dealing with, we need the evidence. We need evidence so that we can build solutions. But in order to get people interested in building solutions, people who aren't already interested, we need to convey these often emotional and troubling narratives that come out of lived experience. So I think that's really important. I mean, this is the gift and the challenge for us, is that we have a bunch of responsibility here, and people are entrusting us with their experience. And I think the idea of turning a rich, troubling narrative into a data set is important, but at the same time, kind of not disrespectful, well, maybe disrespectful in a way. If it's used as that's fine, but if it's, we need to honor stories, and if I don't know, there's something, I guess I'm old fashioned that way. I think storytelling is very convincing. So there's a problem to me of ethical representation, which is the fifth problem. You know, how do you tell an impossible truth? Because reality is always shifting. You got to be totally aware of your judgments. What voice is speaking in the interview? Sometimes when you read your interviews and you read your responses to them, this happens in a lot of groups I've worked with. We realize that in fact we're writing down our notes, but it's our voice, not the voice of the person. It's like we're at a psychiatrist's office and they're making notes about us. You also want to remember who the audience is when you're designing the mobilization of your information. Understanding who your intended audience is, whether you're aware of it or not, will influence how you craft those messages. And revisiting and reconciling changes. Let's say you start doing a bunch of interviews with a group of people, and at some point somebody tells you that their information has changed, and yet you've already published an article or you've given a presentation. This has always been a problem for research, but with lived experience scholarship, it's even more a problem, because lived experience is always transitional, right? It's a liminal experience. So you have to find ways of revisiting that in order to honor the story, if you can. And I think you have to be explicit about these limitations in anything that you produce. When you tell a story, when you refer to findings that you've had, I think I almost always preface my research as this is the information I was able to put together from my experiences so far. And I imagine that some of this will change, but let's go with this, you know, and I literally say that. So this is really important to me. And this idea of trauma porn, and the fact is that haters are going to hate. And when somebody's career is going really well, they're always going to look at your work as if it's great. And when somebody's career isn't going well, they're always going to look at our work like, you know, because people become insecure. This is especially true in academia, and it's especially true in nonprofits, academia, and government work right now, where a lot of people are resistant to the fact that marginalized groups have been marginalized. It's not like they marginalized themselves. And I know people don't like that term and they don't like the word vulnerable, but the system has built vulnerability and marginalization into it. And so the only way to deal with it is to overtly and deliberately make sure that people are included. So when people are included, now this, and I'm speaking personally here, so I'll just own this. I got my job at the age of 59. And I was a new scholar, and I was a white guy. And I know this sounds silly to say it that way. And I'm just being honest. I didn't think I was going to get the job because there was a lot of resistance from other people in the department to aid. They're not going to say that they're ageist, but I was, you know, he's so old. How's he going to get a tenure track job? And he's a he, and he comes from all these other places. And the lived experience element of it was, I think, the key. I think it was the key, but it was the key because I didn't in my application say I'm a person with lived experience, and I never really thought of myself as I didn't pitch myself as that. I mean, I talked about myself as that when they asked me to apply, because they said, you know, your lived experience really shines through in the work that you do, and it's something that we could use here. And I think I'm comfortable with the fact that I got the job. See, this is the reason I say this. I don't think I was objective. You can objectify your own experiences in order. This is the narrow hallway that I have to walk down with this book, for example. There are things in there that I really want to say and I really want to get out, but I feel like I might be objectifying myself. And you know what I mean? Like making my story the object of vicarious scrutiny. And I don't feel like I did that with my work here, because I'm very, very open with my students, and I help them move in different directions. And so lived experience, people like us with lived experience, it shines through in the way we do things, in the way we approach conversations and other people. But when we start writing, especially autoethnographic work or autobiographical work, when we start looking at and this is hard for me to express, and I'm really sorry if I'm screwing it up. when we try to look at how do I fit into that EDI paradigm, we objectify ourselves. And something we have to do, but it's also something that we have to be really careful about. So there are people, like I said, their haters are going to hate. Sometimes we get a job or we get a grant and people question why we got it and they didn't. And sometimes they'll say, oh, it's because they have lived experience, as if that's a bad thing. And I want you to live with no fear of that. If I could say anything, I think as the oldest person in this room, I would say, just as long as you're doing the next right thing, don't worry about what other people think. Okay. I'm going to stop shortly. The rest of the slides are available to you. What I want to say to you is that I'm very influenced by Norman Denson. In fact, I think a couple of you actually had Norman Denson as advisors, if I'm not mistaken. So I gather my information, I mobilize my information through a variety of different messy texts. And I don't think that the work we do has to be neat. I don't think it has to be, our essays can use multiple voices and weave in and out of academic and personal voices. I think that you have to, in this day and age, that we have the tools to produce higher quality digital and visual tools if we want, but we also have the ability to go multi-platform, cross-platform. We've never had so many opportunities to use different techniques to gather and to share information. But I think you can't use any of these things properly until you learn how to do it the old way, like take notes, sitting down and listening, being reflexive. And I think that if you're going to do this kind of work, especially since most of our lived experience scholarship is done in interdisciplinary ways. For example, I have a lot of people I work with who are lived experience scholars who got degrees in different fields, but are teaching now in other disciplines that they didn't get their degrees in, because their activist research is sort of cross-listed with sociology. And yet they got degrees in political science, for example, and yet they're social activists. So they now work in sociology departments. So you have to really establish a way of being fluent in different institutional and public languages. I'm going to just skip ahead to this. So remember, I do a lot of autoethnographic work, linking my own experience to the kinds of questions I ask. But the form of ethnography that I practice is what I call pragmatic public ethnography. And I'm telling you, if you can get your message across, yes, so that's why you say, yeah, poetry, there's nothing wrong with poetry. In the visual methods class that I teach, poetry, art, drawing, textiles, anything that is a form and not just things that we can see, things that we have to touch to understand. So it's interesting, the public ethnography is the really important part of mobilizing lived experience. For your academic and professional roles, as perhaps a researcher or a consultant, you're going to have to produce reports and documents that appeal to, that are evidence-based, and that the evidence is almost always numerical in kind, clean, easy to understand, and has a bottom line. But to access the public and to bring the public, we really need to get the public engaged in the things we're trying to change. Governments and nonprofits, I'm sorry, you guys, I've been doing this stuff for 40 years. They've always been aware of what the problems are. And now we have much more evidence. So the fact that we don't get things done, the fact that in the United States, things happen like they did this week is because the public isn't getting the information in a compelling way. So the public ethnography is a way, at least, there's public sociology, public ethnography, public physics. This is a way of taking the scientific representations, which are legitimate mobilizations of our research, and converting them into ways that the public can more easily access. And the kinds of tools that you have on your cell phone are more than enough to mobilize lived experience in ways that are compelling beyond belief. The other thing I'd like to suggest to you right now is that when we use images of people, especially images of people that have been traditionally cast aside and looked down upon, the images are very powerful. And I've shown you guys this before. The first book we did in Dignity Village, I invited a photographer down who was into character, who always wanted to see deeply into who the people are. And this is what I meant about trauma porn. None of these pictures are focusing on the traumatic side. Like the subtext is poverty. The subtext is whatever you see in the picture, but people are represented here as art, as characters with nuance, relationships in color, you know, the funny, laughing. So we can do that in words. We can do that whenever we present the stories that we're gathering or our own story. There are many lenses that we can use. And I think if we're using visual tools, we have a responsibility to balance that, because visual tools can be pretty dark. So I just wanted to show you, if I could, this link. I hope it'll, if I can open it. Where's open link? Hyperlink. Open. So this is a version of the last of a number of different films that I did. Some of you have seen it. It starts. Let me turn this on.
Home Depot, the owners of them.
It starts with it starts in Tent City in Toronto. It's shot on a bunch of old cameras, but you know, it shows our relationships developing. And then there's some very troubling scenes. It shows the loss of the village. Then it shows the evictions and where people were housed. And then it shows how people's lives were affected by housing. And these are their stories. I mean, I'm telling the story, and we did like 20 different versions. If you go to my website, all the different versions are on there. And that's one way that I can maintain a fidelity to this film, is by have all of it's there. So there's no secrets. I'm not hiding anything from anyone. And also everything that's in here is here because they wanted it to be in. Like there were things that they asked me to show that I thought would get them into trouble. And I told them no. So, and they said, okay, let's not include that. But the amount of things that they did include, the personal conversations, this is what I mean. The authorship is in part theirs, and that's really important to me. It then goes to Dignity Village, and then it then looks at things that have happened more recently in New Brunswick and the state of housing. And so it's a compilation of all these different videos that I've made over the ages. And if you want to watch it, for those of you who haven't seen it, it kind of encompasses everything that I talked about. And then this is the one that I was going to show you before. This film is really important for understanding how lived experience changes, and how it's really important, at least for me, the whole point of the visual work I've been doing was to develop a methodology that could capture and share with people just how amazing and unique and unpredictable the transitions people go through when they get housing become. And I'll end it on that because I really blabbed on, man. Sorry. So that'll be it, Leigh.
That was excellent. Very thoughtful presentation. And I think for a lot of us, we're really quite moved by what it was you were sharing. I know I mentioned in the chat box just a piece that I see it's connected here in the slideshow, the link, but if you would be happy to type that or transpose it into the chat box so we can all copy it easily too. I think that looks like something that a lot of us would probably value very much, the opportunity to immerse ourselves in. One of the questions that was posed to me to sort of share with you as well is the idea, I would love to hear your thoughts briefly before we head to break and before we wrap up, which is, do you think lived experience can shape policy? And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And,
well,
then of course, I'll open it up for other questions as well.
Well, it's funny that you said, because I just had a conversation with Terry Lee this morning. Terry Lee Culford and I have been working on a tiny home policy for years. I've been writing about tiny homes since 1999. And back then people laughed at me and I did face nothing but criticism, but I've spoken at least, I've done keynotes. I've spoken at least 150 times about tiny homes. You know this. I've written about it. I've done 2 books on it. I've made films about it. I've displayed on it. I've spoken to politicians about it. I've advised in different communities. Here in particular, the tiny home community, 12 Neighbors that was built, we were in conversation while they were building it. And now I'm doing a short film on it. So yeah, I 100% believe that we can, and now tiny homes are part of every city's landscape. And I don't mean just tiny homes. I mean the whole question of what does it take to make smaller homes and different alternative types of building and housing parts of our homelessness, parts of our solution to homelessness. So yes, I do believe 100% we can mobilize and affect policy, but we have to do it in the 2 ways. We have to make a public address that the public can get behind. In fact, it's not on the screen, but if you guys look at the slides that I gave you, there's 2 examples. There's the Indigenous definition of homelessness that I contributed to with Jesse when he wrote it, which is a direct mobilization of lived experience of Indigenous peoples facing homelessness that he turned into this amazing typology. And then there's a an example of the Safe at Home report that I worked on with the Dream Team. And these were looking at housing predators and housing takeovers in the city of Toronto from the lived experience and storytelling of people who had experienced social housing in Toronto. And because of the Safe at Home report, the city of Toronto is just wrapping up a 3-year study with the same team based on our research to introduce new provisions to protect tenants in social housing. So 100%, it can be done.
Well, that's always refreshing to hear. I tend to agree with you, but I definitely wanted your perspective. You'll notice, folks, in the chat box, I asked if there was any other additional questions for Eric before we go to break, and thank him for his time. If anyone has anything, the floor is open for the next couple of minutes for Q&A. While I give people the opportunity to make sure that they take advantage of that, I would first say thank you very much for this very thoughtful conversation, Eric. This is a very thoughtful presentation.
It was a little long, I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. In fairness, I mean, it's just about an hour right now from when you started, and there was more to cover, I'm sure. And that said, this was very thoughtful. It was definitely very current to a lot of what I think a lot of people at this table are focused on, and the needs for this type of initiative to be thought. And I definitely really appreciate the evolution of the conversation of your own personal story, which you shared very frankly and very thoughtfully. And how it's influenced not just your own work, but as you mentioned, even it's starting to trickle down into some pretty effective policy. You referenced some of the current tiny home projects that are happening in your neck of the woods you helped advise on. Definitely encourage folks to follow Eric on social media if you haven't. He posts a lot. I was at one point executive director of Tiny Home Alliance Canada, and I used to absolutely pay attention to what Eric was posting because many times he knew about it before a lot of the rest of us, and it was a great comprehensive tool to be able
I don't
to
know, I
share.
reposted your stuff all the time.
Well, then that's great. That's how relationships are supposed to work. That's how we mobilize knowledge. So there you go. You're speaking right to it. That said, folks, if there's no questions at this time, I will say thank you. Eric. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, sorry, I can't. My chat doesn't seem to be working on this iPad.
Oh, that's no problem. It's perfect because I can't see all of the videos. So I'm glad you chimed in. Please take it away.
Just a small one. I'm at a university now. I'm used to doing research with groups of lived experience out of Toronto when it was community-based, and we didn't need a research ethics board's approval to kind of conduct it. But now that I've been looking at doing things through the university where I'm at now, the research ethics board seems very, they're all caught up in their issues about not doing it because of all the risks. I'm just kind of wondering if you have anything to offer as kind of food for thought, experiences of your own, or advice on how we're looking at doing these ethnography, or we're looking at doing research with lived experience groups, specifically people with homelessness experience, how to handle these research ethics boards at these universities where they're fearful of, a whole new wave of problems and diversity.
I get it 100%. So the cool thing about the film that we did, the original films I did with my friends on the streets in Tent City, is that I didn't have to have ethics clearance because it was just a film we were making. I was actually, I'm an artist, and I was reinventing myself as a mural maker, doing interiors and full finishing. And I would hang out at Tent City with my buddies after work because it was just down the street from where I lived. So, that the writing and all that was something I did on my own because it was part of my recovery. Like, that's the truth. And that's how I write the memoir. I'm mobilizing that, how important that research was to my recovery. That's why it looks the way it does and feels the way it does. And I didn't need an R.A.P.P. But then when they wanted to air it on TV, which we agreed as a group that we didn't want. I kind of wanted it, but it was never ready to be shown. Then they wanted us to do what they call errors and omissions. And so I did get letters of consent from everybody, including myself, in the first film, in case they decided that they ever wanted to show it. We had to have that. And then when it was shown at the Royal Ontario Museum, we didn't have ethics clearance, but I said the only way you're going to be able to show this is if you allow the folks in the film, or I invite the folks in the film to be part of this. And so they were. We screened the film at the museum, and everybody who wanted to be on stage talking about it were there. It was amazing, and we filmed that. It was kind of cool. But then when I got into graduate school, I had to do the R.A.Ps. And you're right, it's tough, especially when, it's all about harm. And if you think, and back when I was a student in the 80s, we thought about harm very differently than people think about harm today. We didn't think of triggers in the same way. And so there's a real tendency to look at, if you look, there's some great essays and research done. If you go to Qualitative Research Journal, there's a lot of discussions. In fact, I can send you some of them on ethics and R.E.P.s and how they've changed over time. And so the key is to really think about, I don't know what style you're using. If you're doing a survey and you can anonymize it, it's almost always, or even interviews that aren't being recorded that you can anonymize, the R.E.P. will go quickly. But if you're asking questions that are triggering, in the kind of work that we do, so social justice oriented work, where there are questions of lack, questions of trauma, everything is potentially harming. And it's funny, I never really thought of talking to students about their potential homelessness at university is triggering, but it's very triggering. So yeah, it's really difficult to overcome it. What you need to do is be completely honest about it and think of how you would deal with that situation if it arose. And there is, like I said, lots of articles out there about how to deal with harm amongst work in vulnerable populations. So if you're doing an R.E.P. and you want someone to look at it, I'll look at it for you. I mean,
okay. When I did my master's in political science, I did the survey approach, and it took forever to get the R.E.P. through. And now that I'm looking at starting my PhD, it's again something I'd ideally like to do over the next few years. But
I'd start your R.E.P. now.
Experience was, yeah, that pre-pandemic experience, and then one kind of was lost in pandemic with everything shut down.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just kind of looking ahead to starting in the fall and 4 years of a fight again. So
well, wherever
kind of
it also.
Do I change my research methodology, or do I kind of find better ways to deal with this? Because
if your methodology, sorry to interrupt, but if your methodology is the one that'll work, don't compromise it.
Okay.
We did a study, which I can't show anyone because it was for a private, for the Tony DiPietro residences in Toronto. We were looking at a supportive housing for people living with HIV/AIDS and frail elderly people. It was a really cool supported housing first project where different groups that are usually siloed live together. And they wanted me to study. They felt that there was a very strong community. And I said, well, I'll do a critical study for you. Let's see if there's a community. And if there isn't, we'll get recommendations for you. I said, and we agreed, those who agreed to participate said, yeah, we'll do that. But they have to act or at least tell us what they're going to do about our recommendations. And so we had to get the R.E.P. for that. Took 4 months through the UHPN network. And then the one thing that the ethics board was serious about was that they had to repatriate this information to the community and to publicly address it, and they chose not to. So a university R.E.P. For your work will hold you to task. So whatever you promise in your R.E.P., you have to follow through.
Yeah.
Private, if you're doing applied research, it doesn't necessarily happen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eric. I'd love those resources if you wouldn't mind sharing what you suggested about the harm reduction.
Yeah, do me a favor. I'll give you my email. Shoot me an email to remind me, and I'll send you what I'll put it in the text.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, with that in mind, and being that we're on sort of a time-sensitive schedule, I'll just say if there's any additional questions, I'm happy to forward them on to Eric. And more importantly, I know Eric's information has been posted in the chat. It's eric.weissman@unb.ca. Eric, again, thank you for your time today. Very thoughtful presentation. And, I definitely encourage those who are participating to disseminate this to those, that information to those who could benefit from it, who might not have been able to join us today. I know you have another appointment, and I think I'm going to just take this opportunity once again, say thank you on behalf of everyone involved. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to tell everyone, let's take about another 5 minutes, 5-6 minutes, reconvene for approximately or the top of the hour on my clock at least. So right now my clock says it's 3:54 p.m. So judge accordingly based on your time zones. We'll see you in about 5 or 6 minutes because we want to make sure everyone gets the opportunity to give a full presentation, and there's still a lot to cover. So take a moment, and I'm going to turn my camera off, and I will see you in just a few moments. And again, thank you, Eric. And we've got 2 great presenters still to come here in this presentation.
Take care.
Hope everyone enjoyed their very quick washroom break. Noticed when I was speaking with Eric at the end, for all that I did cover in the facilitation, I never actually introduced myself properly other than to say my name. It came up the tiny home piece. I just started reading the facilitator piece, Always weird to read my own bio, so I'm going to get through this quick as I can. I'm an activist, journalist, and researcher residing in beautiful Mount Pearl, Newfoundland, a former 3-term municipal politician, international bestselling author, and reporter on homelessness. I'm also a first-year student at Memorial University and a lived experience advisory committee at making the shift. Now, with that in mind, I also mentioned that I'm former executive director for Tiny Home Alliance Canada. So again, I can't hit home enough just how thoughtful I thought a lot of what Eric's presentation included was. Furthermore, as a chartered housing professional, I know that a lot of this conversation is very transposable into other forms of social service development and social service delivery. So I very much appreciate how tremendous our speakers are today, and I thank you for sticking with us. We do have a lot to cover, and our next speaker is probably going to need the solid hour of your attention, but it's very exciting. The conversation that we're having includes actual data that's been collected in this process from LivEx members. And I think that's something that's really exciting for a lot of us. And then we have another presenter afterwards, who you probably know very well, who was participating through this process right from the beginning and helped create this particular session. We still have a long way to go. If we do go over time and anyone has to drop off, I'm sure we all understand. This is being recorded and the information will be disseminated as best possible to mobilize that knowledge as best we can. But that said, for those of you who choose to stick with us, I encourage it as long as you can, because there will be opportunities for Q&A. And of course, we always want to make sure these conversations are fluid, they're organic, and they evolve. Without further ado, recognizing time, I'm going to read the bio of our next speaker. And I'll say that my dog is also saying hello, so you'll just have to bear with him. He doesn't particularly care what anyone thinks of him or his opinions, so just bear with me. I'm pulling everything up here, and I've got it. Okay, so in terms of infographics, Kimberly Langille is a B.S.W. R.A.P.P. is a research assistant with the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaboration, also known as CHEC. Kimberly is trained in data visualization from Humber College's Research Analyst Postgraduate program. She creates infographics and promotional materials for CHEC affiliated events. Kimberly offers guidance to those interested in creating infographics for mobilizing research. This is definitely exciting stuff, and we really want to make sure that everyone takes advantage of the session as best we can. And without further ado, Kimberly, feel free to take it over. We do appreciate you making time for us here today. I'm just going to turn my camera off, but I'm here if you need me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Leigh, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. If everyone can see it okay. Let's see. Yep. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Kimberly, and I, like Leigh was saying, work for the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative. And we're these network of researchers that within CHEC work to mobilize research of their studies and to identify evidence-based solutions for policymakers. So that's a big chunk of our work. Well, I'm a research assistant, so I help with a lot of different research studies for CHEC partners. Recently, I worked on infographics for the Marco study, which is out of St. Michael's Hospital with MAP Urban Solutions. And it was a study of survivors of violence and they're experiencing accessing different sort of support, such as shelter and other housing help during the pandemic. And it also looked at service providers' experiences as well. So I made 6 infographics for the release of their study. But again, I also work on a few. So my role in the team, as said, is I design newsletters, graphics, and other materials, often to promote CHEC events or CHEC affiliated events. So yeah, and I just want to say thank you for accepting me into this space, as I'm not a person of lived experience with homelessness or housing insecurity. So I just, yeah, I'm just very thankful that you're allowing me into this space and taking the time to listen today. So I think I get a lot of enjoyment out of making infographics because I know that um, with releasing them, they really have helped to reach many groups of people to know, to understand the housing situation in Canada better and different best policy solutions. So it's one of the most, like, probably one of my favorite parts of my job. So I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to let you know about what goes into making an effective infographic for mobilizing research. And I will also be giving an overview of Canva today, which is a browser-based infographic software, but it also is for other social media and graphic design uses as well. And I will be guiding you through an infographic I made, which is based on the study of a LivEx member named Jessica Annan, who is also the Bursey committee member and the steering member of Making the Shift. So yes, very happy to be here. I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm delivering this presentation as a settler on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So it's known as Milton, Ontario. I also recognize the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee people and the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live on these lands today and have for thousands of years. It is our collective responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, and ancestors that have walked before us. So I wanted to talk a bit about knowledge mobilization, but I'm sure that a lot of you have background knowledge about it already. But traditionally, yes, knowledge mobilization focuses on the production and use of research through processes such as dissemination, exchange, and co-creation between researchers and knowledge users. But I would like to think that's even more important to think of knowledge mobilization in the sense of how it can be used to maximize the impact of research, especially pertaining to the people who are involved, so the knowledge users and the and people of lived experience. So, and I'm just really glad to be here with Making the Shift today, because this organization is very focused, on involving youth with lived experience and co-creating and co-designing projects that explore what works in preventing youth homelessness prevention and ending it. So maybe I'll start off with a question to you. What is an infographic? And you can just type it in the chat. Also, sorry, I wanted to note that I can't actually see my Zoom screen right now. So Leigh, if there's any responses in the chat, would you be able to read them to me?
Sure. So right now I see information depicted through pictures has been listed, as well as a visual representation of information.
Yeah.
At
Yeah,
the moment, those are the two.
for sure. And that's very accurate. basically, an infographic is a visual that uses data to explain complex issues in a quick and effective way. And it is a tool that interweaves elements such as charts, text images, diagrams, and now recently videos as well, which I haven't seen incorporated as much myself, but I think that's very exciting. And I think just the opportunity of infographics is also very, in itself, very accessible too with the tools that we have today, such as Canva, which offers a free edition of, so that anyone can go into account and make their own infographics, because it is a way of sharing information that can be, again, widely dispersed to different groups and uh, different sort of groups of all sorts of backgrounds and experiences. Because when you think about how knowledge is usually presented, it oftentimes, if it's in a journal, you have that paywall of needing to pay to access the journal. There might be subscriptions, and it's just, it isn't an entirely accessible way that people can access this information, especially people who are taking their time to contribute to studies. Uh, we can't always say that these people would have the means to sign up or to pay to buy a journal article or to buy access in a way. So, and I just find that infographics are very, in this way, a more accessible form of dispersing information, but also in the sense that nowadays anyone can do it, and you don't necessarily have to be a graphic designer, because there's so many templates out there that you can use and just make your own. So infographics, they can represent either qualitative or quantitative information, although the information should be presented in a concise, low burden, and eye-catching manner, because you don't want to overwhelm your readers with words. And that's it's one challenge for qualitative information, because you might have an in-depth account from people where they're really sharing a lot about their experiences and their perspectives. Although you don't want to make like a 3-page or 5-page infographic, because it's usually narrowed down to 1 page. So there's that challenge in that, and really having to pick out that key information that is important and that is trying to highlight the key message and takeaways. So I feel like a lot of us have seen infographics before, but these are just some examples. We see some ones that are in landscape here. And then this is a vertical one for Statistics Canada. But they can be presented in either as, they can be presented almost as a timeline where you're running through events, or you can highlight different diagrams such as maps. Truly, there is unlimited ways that you can format an infographic, so that is very exciting. So in terms of why do we use infographics, more of, well, I've already listed some reasons, but truly they're a quick, informative snapshot of your research, which puts the data at the forefront. And the use of graphs, images, and colors can appeal to different learning styles. And because it was found that people following directions with text and illustrations do 323% better than people following directions without illustrations. So just trying to appeal to different learning styles. And much of the sensory cortex in our brain is for vision and processing, which makes visuals helpful in memorizing this information. And then in terms of different software that you can make an infographic from, there's Canva, which we'll be going over today, which is browser-based with PowerPoint, social media, and infographic templates to design an application. And there are different tiers of plans, very similar to that of Infogram, which is also browser-based and mainly focuses on infographic templates for a variety of sectors. And then we also have examples such as Pictochart, Adobe Illustrator, and Easily. Although I would say that my favorite program would definitely be Canva, just due to the breadth of templates and also the great quality graphics that I've found. So before I get into going through the infographic that I made based on Jessica's study, I wanted to discuss what you should first consider before even making your infographic and in the process of planning. So like I said before, we always want to consider who our audience is. So that's asking yourself, who is your audience? But also, what are their media habits, background knowledge, and available time devoted to the main message of your infographic? What types of media do they generally consume? Is it written, audio, visual, social media? And it's an important question too, because, well, we would assume that a lot of people have access to the internet. There's still a digital divide, and perhaps at times, we certainly have seen this, uh, uh, disseminating your infographic through social media may not always be the best way to reach the communities or members that you want to. Do they have lived experience with your message? Is it something that will immediately capture their eye and attention? But also, does it represent diversity in your target audience? So related to age, class, gender, and other social locations? But also, how will your audience respond to the text and fonts you're using? Which is also an issue about accessibility too, and thinking about things such as size, color. It can, like, because we don't always perceive things the same way. Font size that might be fine for you, Times New Roman size 12 might not always be as readable to other groups of people. So it's very important to consider that. And say if you are working on a project with community members, and you're wanting to figure out these questions, they can really provide valuable insight into questions like, especially media habits, what's the best way to consume infographics, and they would be a very valuable resource. But also, I like to look at an infographic in a way that uses data from studies to tell a story. And if you're a researcher who's used to making academic articles, you can think about it in a similar way of sections from your research papers, but although simplified and just not with the same headings. So you can think of that an infographic would have a title, an introduction, findings, and a conclusion. So the title, it's very helpful that it incorporates just the 5 W's and 1 H that a lot of us are familiar with. So who, what, where, when, how. That would give the reader a real sense if this is something of interest to them. Should they stop and read it for who knows how long, maybe the 1 minute or so that it takes to, or even less. There's typically an introduction after that. So it can be a definition of one of the major concepts of the study that you're covering, or a 1 to 2 sentence description of the study or topic that includes a hook. And more so, what is the goal? The findings section would organize main points using elements such as charts, text images, diagrams, and in this case, it would be qualitative findings to display what was found. So a block that represents each individual section of a data visualization. For example, you may have a bar chart starting off at the left of the side of the screen, but then after that, you would move to a line graph. And if we're thinking in charts, each one of those charts would count as their own block. But if you're using qualitative information, maybe it's a theme with different quotes from knowledge users or participants. So we would also want to use minimal words just to give some context to the reader of what they're looking at. And then in terms of ending off your infographic, you would oftentimes it's very effective to summarize findings or to have a takeaway or call to action. So those are steps or actions that the reader can take with them, and a nice wrap up to your infographic. And here's just another way of thinking about how to make an impactful infographic through the acronym UMA, which doesn't mean anything as a word, but it stands for understand. So if you can make the viewer understand quickly and precisely the underlying message of your infographic. Move, and that means to make the viewer feel something about the research evidence presented. And act, which is to make the viewer feel that they can take some actions and take those actions with them and even work on carrying them out. And this is just another outline that sort of visualizes what I've already said. And getting into the more technical stuff, but which is also a very important, it's a very important consideration. It's the way that you organize your infographic. So you should organize your infographic in a way that your readers would naturally take it in. And thinking about it language-wise, if you're making an infographic for English readers, it would usually be from left to right. Although you have to think about your audience too, because I was seeing infographics in Arabic was from right to left, and it's an important consideration to think about who your audience is and how they would be taking in the information. Although obviously, it can be best to present. Yeah, okay, I already said this. So then another tip, which I can demonstrate more once we get into actually doing the live demonstration and guidance of the infographic, is how you can use shapes to help guide your readers through your infographic. So if you're moving from different blocks, you may find it helpful to use arrows or straight line dividers to guide your readers, just so they understand what section is coming up next, or the transition between sections more so. And this is another very technical aspect of thinking about infographics, which is more having to do with quantitative research. And it comes from Edward Tuff, who is an information visualization expert and artist, who coined the following ratio in his book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And it's called the data ink ratio. So basically you see this formula on the screen, and you see that data ink and total ink are over each other. So data ink is elements conveying data information, and total ink is all elements in the chart. Although data ink is concerned with only keeping elements that add new information to infographics while minimizing those that are considered unessential or distracting. So I do have an example here, because when I learned about this concept, I was a little bit surprised because it didn't feel as intuitive, or like some things that I would have done, I've realized that, oh, that's not an actual essential thing that you need to do. But this is a chart of penguin and body mass. So it's it's not exactly within the realm of people, but I think it's a great example. And it shows all the elements of the chart, the title, different the x-axis, sorry, of the variables. So I just want to turn over this question to anyone in the chat, if they can look at elements of this chart and sort of, give any ideas of what they think can be eliminated in the chart, or maybe altered to gain a higher data ink ratio.
Could you use a pie chart or something like that so it takes up less room? And
A pie chart? Let me see. I think just because this is in grams, you would probably want to keep it as a bar chart. But more so like just looking at the colors, or even like the labels on the different axes. If anyone would know, if there's like, if anyone would have an idea of what can be either eliminated or changed.
So what I'm reading here is that people are having trouble seeing the third bar as it's too light. I can see it from my angle, so it might just be based on the color scheme for some computer definitions. Also seeing a comment that says swap vertical axis for data labels above bars.
That's very
but-
interesting. Yeah.
Or remove legend if unnecessary. The moment
Yeah.
those are, I think we're caught up on the comments. Those are the only ones that are listed at the moment. Oh, getting rid of a lot of the negative space by bringing the bars closer together, which definitely sounds like a sound suggestion.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, and a lot of you are hitting on some of like the key points. So for example, it would be to remove the gray background, because it doesn't really add anything in particular. And when you're including a chart on, a chart in your infographic, uh, you might not always want that contrast. And if your color of your bars is something that would show up uh, on the background of your infographic, you don't need like an additional background color with it. Um, but someone in the chat did mention this, and you can definitely remove the legend as there's already x-axis labels. So that's a great suggestion. Because, and then we also have the graph bars. You can also just make that into one color, as the x-axis indicates differences already. So you can see the labels on the bottom. But then you can remove bolding as well. And then the y-axis values can be removed. And as someone also suggested before, they can just be put over the bars themselves. So a lot of you hit on great key points there, because really this is just about sort of eliminating noise from the charts that you don't necessarily need to sort of communicate the main sort of data of your charts. It's just about keeping the essential stuff. So great job.
I'll chime in here for just
Yeah.
a second, because there was a great comment from Elaine that says use primary colors. So I might be able to see the gray and the green on the third of my piece myself, but at the same time, that's probably a really thoughtful suggestion, because I can see that on this screen with this color contrast. But many times if this were printed into a document, or if it was put through some type of formatting, you might not have direct control over who's to know what that might look like. So yeah, there was another suggestion there, was to use primary colors, which you've kind of hit on.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And it's great that you're sort of seeing it through the view of people, either, different formats of software, or just but also just how people can perceive colors differently, which we'll get to as well. So those are important considerations. And yeah, like as we said here as well, they don't need to be different colors, the bars itself, just because you have like the x-axis labels. But yeah, that's a great suggestion. Are there any other comments anyone has?
No others listed at this time, so I encourage you to go ahead.
Okay, great. Another thing too is that you want to ensure you can provide straightforward and useful charts. So a pictogram is a great example, because it can be used to show in an infographic how many people, in a group either think a certain way, or, engage in a behavior. So when you're using this sort of chart, you can really consider using it in simplified terms to represent your data. So for example, instead of displaying 10 out of 100 user internet habits, you can actually just simplify that and say 1 out of 10 users, because I think that really narrows down for people. And it's a smaller number, so it becomes a little bit less overwhelming to think about that in terms of proportions. Or but also another thing I've been thinking about is, by using this tip, you can reduce space in your infographic as well. And that's probably what you would want, especially if you're using qualitative data. You would really want more space. But if you're using mixed methods too, this would only come in that situation. But yeah, if you're really aiming for space, this is a good tip as well. And then we touched on color, Elaine did, which is also a very important consideration when you're making your infographics, because like color can really invoke different emotions for readers, and can it can get across messages or feelings that's, that you don't need to write out. They're just sort of like instinctual to people. Um, or, yeah, it's more of a instinctual experience that some colors can sort of incite in different people. Um, so if you're trying to create awareness of your project and organization, you can use on-brand colors to enhance recall of your readers. Or if you're wanting to use colors to relate to the certain topics in your infographic, you can do that as well. So for example, statistics on swimming accidents or related to swimming, maybe you want to use a blue background to tie in that theme. But yeah, it depends on what you want to aim towards in this sort of situation, but colors can be very effective. So like I said, they can promote your project, invoke emotion, and tie recall to relationships in infographics. But we do also want to consider that humans as ourselves, we don't always perceive colors in the same ways. So there has been a conversation about colorblind friendly pairings. And this was something that I learned in my data visualization course, which is something I honestly haven't considered about, is color blindness. And in this picture, you can see these charts and sort of how a person with protanopia, normal vision, and deuteranopia see a range of colors and how that can differ. So over here, you're seeing a lot of yellow, mainly orange, blue, and then deuteranopia, you're seeing a similar scheme as well. So it just, as we consider how effective colors can be in really trying to communicate our message, we should also consider too that not everyone views them the same way or can even pick up on the same colors. So one suggestion that has been given towards making infographics is to go by different color pairings that can be more colorblind friendly for readers. So for example, we have blue and orange, blue and red, blue and brown are some color pairings that can be seen as colorblind friendly or helpful. And then I also have this tool that I would like to show because it's a color palette generator. So let me just minimize my screen. And yeah, this was a tool created by davidmathlogic.com, and it talks about color blindness. And then it talks about the importance of having this palette. But it's also great in the sense that you can look at, you can use this tool that makes hex colors to kind of generate a color palette that you can use in your infographics. And then, yeah, so if you click on that, that will then adjust to the below color palette. And then this is a section on accessible palettes. So we see the orange and the blue, yellow and purple. And these hex codes can be super useful when you're using Canva, because you can actually put them in the color search engine and they will come up. So yeah, this can be a pretty useful tool. And when we're talking about accessibility, of course, it's not just, about color when it comes to infographics. There's so many other ways that accessibility should be considered, either in alt text or, again, different fonts. So for Canva, it doesn't look like there's an option to have alt text. I know that PDF does have an option for alt text. But yeah, it just goes to show that there's a lot of different considerations for accessibility. And if anyone has any tools for accessibility in terms of graphic design or infographics that they know of, please go ahead and put them in the chat, because I think that would be very useful to everyone, and I'm very interested in seeing them as well. So then moving on to, this is a very, I wouldn't say it's not like super important, but I think it's more stylistic in the sense that, yeah,
Could I
go
interrupt
ahead.
you for just a second? I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
There was
for
a question,
sure.
says, please explain what alt text is.
Alt text, for sure. So that is basically, alt text is text that describes an image that can be very helpful for people using screen readers. So sometimes, it's embedded in code, but also some functions which I believe, or some programs that I believe, like PDF, you can click on an image and put in alt text in a field. Um, and oftentimes it's just a few sentences that describes what's in the photo. Yeah, is that more clear?
Definitely appreciate that. Didn't mean to interrupt, but I appreciate your clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and if anyone has any other questions, yeah, feel free. Um, but yeah, and of course, if anyone knows any other tools for accessible design in infographics or whatnot, that would be super useful. Um, and just looking at the time, I'll go over the slide quickly. This is more, I think, of a stylistic thing, but keeping the style of your images consistent. Uh, it can just make sure that your images are serving you to be focused on your message, but also just serving not to be as distracting for your readers. And I just gave an example of um, sort of how on the left side, you see that there's a purple cartoon of broccoli and then a real life woman. If you have these two things in infographics, they can be a little mismatched or not matched. And it might be distracting for some people. But on the right side, if you're trying to use a style of images that are more consistent of in a certain medium or type, so whether if they're cartoons or real life people or real life images, if you stick to one style, it can make your message seem more cohesive and just be a little bit less distracting. Um, but I feel like that's more of a style consideration, um, not necessarily important, especially when you use your own creativity in infographics or consulting with people with lived experience when doing so as well. But I would like to move on to sort of doing a quick overview of Canva and then a guidance of the infographic that I made based on Jessica's study. So, let's see. Okay, so it looks like you can still see my screen. So this is the loading screen of Canva. And when you get on here, well, first you would likely have to make an account if you haven't already. But when you get on this page, you'll see different options of the types of projects you can design. So presentations, social media, videos, and print products. And then it makes it very easy in the sense that you can type in what you want to design as well. So say if you want to design an infographic, you can just click and go here. And you'll see the different types of infographics that are available. A cool tool that I really like is that on this left side panel, you can put in what style you would like for your infographic. Well, we can just say infographic, we can check that box. Theme, for example, education. If you check those two, then you can move on to color, which, say if you want to use and you want an orange infographic, it matches the message you're trying to convey, or you're thinking about those accessible color pairings, then this is what you would get. So it's quite cool how you can easily narrow down the templates because there is a lot of them. So it's a useful process being able to narrow them down like this. And then I'll bring up the infographic that I made based on Jessica Annan's study. The title of the study is called An Uncomfortable City, and Uncomfortable City, a community-based investigation of hostile architecture in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And this study basically involved Jessica interviewing and just having a conversation with people of lived experience with homelessness in Calgary who are also advocates as well, on their perspectives of hostile architecture. And the purpose was to have to sort of see how these lived experiences and knowledge of this discriminatory practice lead to a sociological analysis on the topic. So in here, well, maybe just also a trigger warning as well. If you do need to step away because of the information that is like I think there's a few points sort of detailing more of people's experiences and not just the architecture itself. If you need to step away and take a break, that's totally okay. I understand. But yeah, I wanted to give you a look of this infographic and just well, first I think we can take a look at the design view itself. So up here we have templates, and these are just, again, templates of infographics that you can browse through. But it's also cool that you can select which color you would like. Even you can select a language too. So it's just another form of narrowing down templates. But then you have the elements view, which is where you would find your lines and shapes, graphics, stickers, photos, videos. And this is probably my most used sort of view of this project because of the different images I was looking through. And then we have uploads, which is for any media that you would upload. It's great for uploading logos or pictures. We have text, so you can add a bigger heading, a subheading, or little text, but also it comes with different font combinations. Then we have styles, which is a great tool as well. The only thing is that with the brand kit, it does seem to now be included with a paid membership, so that's just something to consider. But it's very helpful if you have a certain color scheme. You can upload it, and it will just stay here, and you can come back to it for different projects as well. And then we also have our logos view. But in my infographic, using the examples of the color pairings I was discussing before, I really tried to sort of incorporate that into this infographic. I used a lot of speech bubbles because this is qualitative, and different quotes from the advocates here, which included TK, Fran, Randy, and Nigel. But I also have, when we're starting off, I have the title, but just this section of an introduction. So we have an introduction to the term of hostile architecture. So that's the definition that Jessica and the advocates, they came to themselves, which is the relocation of the population through urban design. So that can be through architecture such as unsleepable benches, anti-homeless spikes, and fins. And this was a hard one to incorporate in visual terms, but I tried to get creative because Canva did have a bench available, but not like the anti-homeless spikes. So I tried to make some by just using a ledge and then typing in spikes. But I want to draw your attention back to elements and say if you did want to work through a free membership and you want to narrow down which images are included in that, say you can say a walking person, someone who's walking, you can go to this filter icon, and then you can put in what's free. And even if you had some colors you're interested as well, and then you can apply the filters. So yeah, this was very helpful too when making this infographic because I was considering that not everyone has access to a paid plan. So I did make the infographic based on images that were already available. So this is my introduction for the infographic. But then I got into sort of the main findings. So we have those on unsleepable benches, TK's experience of how for someone who's exhausted, the ground is cold or frozen, how awful it can be, not to find a bench that is easy to lay on in the situation. Rather, you find benches that have handles in the middle of them where someone can't lay down, and this is an intentional part of that design. And then you have Nigel, who said that they didn't think that anyone should be left to sleep on benches, but sometimes this is the only option, and the existence of these benches and other hostile structure can remind us that public urban spaces or the commons are not open to all to that same degree, and that can actually antagonize certain groups. And I also just included graphics here of someone waiting out in the cold. So then we have the art blocking heating vents, which I found out that was a thing in Calgary for the study, that there was art on heating vents near C-train platforms, so that can discourage people from laying on them for warmth. So TK said they started stagnating big meta objects so that they can't lay down on the heating vents. Where are you going to go? All the buildings are locked. There's no heating. There's no place for them to lay down comfortably. And then, well, I think hostile architecture really has interfered with people that are rogues. They are people that don't access shelters. And for people that are up and out all night, who are used to using C-tray platforms for warmth, you know, the statues, the steel statue artwork that's put at, I think it's Center Street C-train station right downtown. So yeah, and these are things that well, I think unless someone who has lived experience, like for other people, it's something that you wouldn't even consider, or it's something that you can easily miss. Like you wouldn't think, oh, you know, a bench, for example, it has armrests. Well, it's there to rest your arms, but really it's has a more like sinister thought process design like behind it, as it's just, yeah, it's very interesting. Like for me, especially someone who doesn't have lived experience in hearing about this. And then we have the lack of seating options. So there's definitely going to need to be places to sit, especially towards West Kirby, because there is a senior center there. And that street has got centers or stores and shops. A lot more seniors from that building are gonna want to come down into that little area. So if there's no one for them to sit, uh, I can't really see them wanting to go to that area. And then that was Randy. And then all the benches are removed on Stephen Avenue. Almost everywhere you go now, it's just a diversion. It's directed towards the homeless population, and I think it's terrible, Fran. And then there's another graphic. And also when I made this graphic, like there's that creativity that sometimes you have to use, because obviously there wasn't pictures of like of sculptures on heating vents. I sort of had to overlap them with a heating vent. And the way you can do this is if you have a graphic, right? If you look this up, I looked up statue. Say it might, well, say if by chance you looked these up first and added them before the heating vent, they might have been to the back. So if you ever wanted to fix this in Canva, you can right click and then say, just like bring them forward. And same if you want to send them backwards. So bring to front. And then for this image, I also just looked up speech bubbles, which there's many different forms, many different types that you can look up. And of course, if you want to narrow them down to the free option, you'll see these. So, and then ending off the infographic, we can support the right to commons for all and confront hostility against individuals facing homelessness by talking to family and friends about hostile architecture, seeking policy change, and sharing what we know and how we think our urban spaces can be liberated. And this is that section where it's that call to action that I was talking about earlier. And I made it in a list form. So I looked up, I think I looked up list for this because this is often a tool that you can use if you want to, if you want to show a list or have some recommendations in your infographic. So that's what I used. And that's sort of the end of this infographic. I can also see areas where I may have wanted to add definitions. I was thinking before like robes, but I did see that they did provide a definition. They are people that don't access shelters. If you ever wanted space to add a definition, you can just go to text and maybe, okay, I need to make this bigger. You can adjust the size at the top in this toolbar in the font. And you can just add a star and then add what the definition is. But yeah, that's just another tip as well. If you feel like something needs to be clarified, and that's really important to your message. Yeah, and I tried to make this infographic with an audience of, you know, not just researchers, but just people that, you know, they could have lived experience or others that are interested in sort of how to support the right to commons, and sort of how to make sure everyone has that access to an urban common space. So this is sort of the population which I dedicated the infographic to. And then at the end, I just added the source of Jessica's thesis, although this was based off of their defense presentation. But yeah, this is yeah, this was my presentation. We can go back and I can just give a recap of key points. So it's just to organize your infographic in a way that readers would naturally take it in. So that's accounting for the language of your readers, which, you know, may or may not always be in English. So that's something to consider. Using shapes to help guide your readers through your infographic. Maintaining a high data ink ratio. Ensuring that you provide useful and clear charts. And using a cohesive color palette and image set. I just realized, sorry, that I didn't go through charts, but I can do it very quickly. But I do want to get to Elaine's presentation. You can find charts if you go down, if you click on elements. Oh. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought they were here for, okay, I think Yes, I'm pretty sure it's here. Graphics. Okay. Sorry. I'm trying to recall. It's been a little bit since I've made a graphic in Canva, so I'm trying to call where the charts are. Oh, they're right here. It's more, and then you go to charts, and here are charts that you can use to adjust. You can adjust them based on your data. So you can see the percentage real right here, and the line height you can adjust, for example. So that's just with a pie chart. Then you have your graphs, which provides almost like an Excel series of data that you can adjust. And these are your data points. But this would appear on a, sorry. If we're making, okay, this would appear on your x-axis, and then this would be your y-axis. But yeah, so it would be under more, the more section where you could find your charts. But yes, thank you everyone for attending this talk. And if you have any questions, you're more than free to list them in the chat. Although I do know that Elaine has like still her presentation as well. So if you do have any comments or questions, still, yeah, go ahead. I'm happy to look through them.
Appreciate that. I'll turn my camera back on here now. For starters, a huge thank you very much, Kimberly, for what was a very, very thoughtful presentation. A lot of data there, and I'm sorry we didn't get an opportunity to go through each and every slide, but it's wonderful when speakers come forward with so much information to share. That said, what I might do is, with the interest of time, I'm going to save any possible Q&A to the end so that we can just get right into Elaine's presentation, which I think would be fair, as someone who also has a lot to offer this and has definitely been a huge part of putting this wonderful session together. So without further ado, I'm going to get to Elaine, but I want to make sure that I also make sure I hit home her fantastic resume as well. So again, thank you, Kimberly. Tremendous presentation. We're going to switch now to a topic pretty general that I think we could probably learn a lot about just the same. Research posters. I am a terrible visual artist. So while I think research posters are something that I've probably made, something I've seen countless of, I've always wondered how to make them the most effective they can possibly be. So Elaine LaBerge, as a PhD, is the coordinator of the LivEx Emerging Scholars. We work with her pretty closely here at LivEx to making the shift. Elaine is a professional graphic designer who will demonstrate how you can create radical research posters to get people engaged with your research. And I think that's an important definition, radical research posters. Anyone could probably download a paint program or go to any litany of different quick programs and type in data, but it's definitely something when you're able to grab somebody and bring something forward that hopefully makes people enthused or evokes a certain level of emotionality that sort of brings that call to action right to the forefront. And as I mentioned earlier, as a punk rocker, my favorite bands in history, and favorite activism initiatives and agendas have been kickstarted by some very vivid images that are done in a very powerful way. So Elaine, please take it away. I look forward to learning more about this. And I thank you all for continuing to stick with us. If we do go over time, again, you're welcome to log off if you have to. We understand that, but we encourage you to stick around to the end because I want to make sure there's ample time for question and answer, and there's just a lot of data to get through. But a reminder that it is recorded, so if you did have to step away, hopefully you could still share and disseminate this information and learn from each other along the way by revisiting this another time. Please stick around. Elaine, take it away, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Leigh, and thank you, Kimberly. And just before I forget, Kimberly, you taught me something that I hadn't realized. People tend to have with their research titles that go on for an entire paragraph. And you taught me that you shorten titles on your infographics. Can you maybe just speak to that briefly?
For sure. Yeah, in terms of, yeah, you definitely do want to shorten your titles if they are super long. Like I think the title that that for the study for Jessica um is pretty concise, but I would say if your title is pretty lengthy, you can always include a part of your title, like a part of that title from the research study uh, in the title, but also you can say something like, for example, an uncomfortable city, findings of hostile architecture from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to sort of narrow it down. And then uh, that it doesn't, and then at the end of your infographic, you'll have that citation of the study's name itself. So that's just one way that you can take some words off of your infographic. So it's not taking up like a quarter of your page. Yeah.
Thank you, Kimberly. That was such a great learning lesson. Jess's title of her research is one of the more brilliant ones I've seen, just because it is so short, concise, and really tells you what this research is about. And so what's going to be exciting, folks, in the research posters I'm going to show you today, I want you, first of all, to know you don't have to be a professional graphic designer. And from my stance and experience, the point of a research poster is to invite people into a conversation, not to tell the whole story. That's the critical part of the knowledge mobilization piece. So the research posters that you're going to see, some of them have next to nothing on them, and that's very intentional. And what also is exciting is that you're seeing the very first draft of Jess's research poster. And this is going to go through a lot of iterations as Jess and I collaborate in creating this research poster. And when you're working, for example, with a designer, you want to make sure it's a collaboration, because that designer needs to be taught about your research, and you both need to work together to really, what is the messaging that you want to get out there. And some of the research posters I'll show you I did for my own research. And I think one of the most important messages I want to share with folks is that I started mobilizing my research when I was an undergrad student. Again, as Leigh taught us at the beginning, you don't have to wait for 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. You can start doing it right away. So in my PhD, I actually integrated knowledge mobilization as a method. And this is all, nobody taught me this. It just seemed intuitive to me, probably because I have a sales background, is how am I engaging people in conversations? And by using integrated knowledge mobilization, I was learning from people as I was going along, which absolutely impacted and influenced my research. So that's really, really exciting. And so one of the interesting things about Jess's research, as most research, is that you have to educate people. As we had been discussing before we started the session today and before we started recording, is a lot of folks don't know what hostile architecture, violent architecture, homeless deterrence technology actually is. So when Kimberly was talking about art on top of heating grates, this is this picture right here. So right away, we know that there's a problem with this research poster. There's a lot of text already. But one of the things that we thought about is, how can we have some subtitles that grab people's attention? So you own this is really important, because so much of the hostile architecture is taxpayer funded. When you go back, and if you're going to school and you look around your campuses, you're going to find those benches that people can't lay down on. And in Canada, our higher education institutions are publicly funded. Taxpayers are paying for this. Again, I need to sit down, but where can we sit down? some of this hostile architecture actually is dangerous and can cause immense damage to bodies, if not kill people. The homeless, the violent architecture is actually extending to spikes being put on trees so that birds can't land. So we see how this is just extending out to not just impact people, but to impact wildlife as well. So we've got these problems, and Jess's research is sociological. So she's highlighting the problems from a sociological perspective and then saying the very people that she worked with have the solutions. So I will be sharing iterations of this research poster as it comes along on my website, which I posted in the chat room. Now, my internet's working a little bit slow today, so bear with me. I'm going to show you the very first research poster I did, and it scared people. Whoops, is that coming across really tiny?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Really tiny.
why is it coming across so tiny?
There it is. It's getting bigger.
Okay, whoops, sorry.
We're actually getting a question now as to how to see these slides in full screen. Is there an option that you can do that, Elaine, to be able to show us? Because I actually don't have control of that as the moderator.
It's actually on my website. I'm showing you my portfolio.
Great.
So anybody can go to that link right now and follow along right in the website.
Great. So to answer that question, if you were to scroll up through the chat, and I'm sure we can repost it at the end too to make sure everyone has that. We'll make sure that that is as clear as it can be for everyone who wants to get involved.
So I can put it in the chat room again. There, I just put it in the chat room again. So this poster comes back to something Eric talked about and how we viscerally experience things. So this research poster is quite big. This was pre-COVID days when, still doing print stuff. And so I was making a very intentional statement. So in sociology, introductory sociology classes and in the textbooks, we're taught about India has a social caste system. And my argument is, so does Canada. So you'll get pages and pages on India's social caste system, and then a couple paragraphs on Canada's social class system. So this poster was up on the wall, and beside it, I had a bunch of sticky notes so people could leave messages if they want. And I took a paper bag and I crumpled it up and I put some mud on the outside of the bag, and I stuck the bag to the wall, and inside were felt pens. You'd have to reach in to get a felt pen to write your comments. But inside that bag, I had Kleenex. Even professors who knew me put their hand in the bag, felt the Kleenex, and jerked their hand out, assuming it was dirty, snotty Kleenex. Which was very telling to think, why would you think that? And when I first presented this poster, this is about knowing your audience and not being able to anticipate how people might experience this. The first time I showed the research poster, people were terrified to come up to it. When I showed this poster again at a different university, people were absolutely engaged with it. And all the sayings on the hand are different terms that mostly academics use to describe poor people. And so those represent the wrinkle, the lines in our hand. And so it is about, in Canada, as a colonized nation, there actually aren't any widening access and participation mandates, initiatives, or policies to support students from poverty to be able to make it to university, successfully complete, and then transition in good ways into the workplace. So let me see if I can download. Are folks on the website? So that I could just show this image rather than downloading each poster?
I haven't. Yeah, okay, so we've gotten at least one person who has signified yes. I'm going to stick with it just through the format that it's being displayed for my purposes, but
yeah,
I
I'm
encourage
just on
everyone
the
to.
iPad too.
Perfect.
Okay, I don't
encourage everyone
know.
to do that.
I do not know why this isn't downloading properly. Sorry, folks. I'm at
It looks great. It's just, it looks great. It's just small.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I did for Echoes of Poverty, Composing Lives in Higher Education is from my master's research. And this design format matches the poster I designed to recruit participants. And so at first when I designed it, it was all very dark and gloomy and goth. And one of my supervisors said, Elaine, you're just going to scare people away. So I made it colorful and engaging. So I wanted the pieces to match. So I was doing basically branding of my research. So I incorporated sayings from each research participant, and I included the, I wonder if this works. No, that doesn't work any better. I included what the research conversation was, how we did it, outcomes, where I got funding from. And so again, this is a square research poster. Think about shape when you're doing it for print. Nobody says it has to be this traditional landscape or just portrait. And the square really worked. Just the idea that it was square really drew people in. And again, there's enough there that somebody could look and read the research poster without my actually standing there. But I will tell you, with my research posters, people get engaged. I presented these two posters that I just showed you at a conference, and I was talking to somebody who came up, and I turned around and there were some 35 people around me wanting to learn and engage. And when you consider in Canada, a country where talking about social class is so profoundly taboo, as a colonized nation, the hatred and fear of the poor is palpable. This was a big thing. As an introvert, it was utterly terrifying. Now, this research poster, Media Portrayals of White Trash, it was the very first research poster I did as an undergraduate student. And I was able to get funding to actually hire an artist to draw this image for me. Now, I find this research poster to be very text heavy. I didn't quite know any better, but it still is it's a lot more inviting than the traditional research poster. And most research posters that I see researchers do, it's almost like the thesis or dissertation has been dumped right onto the page. Nobody is going to read it. Nobody wants to read it. And there is no need to put all that information. It's again, the point of this imagery on this one is you can't help but being drawn to the person's eye. And this is a very, very controversial topic that I got the first time I ever got funding to do research, the first time in my life I was ever actually able to focus on school first rather than third and fourth down the list, because I was always working so many jobs to survive. And it was based on the show, if folks know it, out of the United States, a reality TV show, Here Comes Honey Boo Boo. So it's a show about a single soul mom and her 4 daughters who are all in abject poverty. Every stereotype you can imagine was on full display. It couldn't be more polar opposite than, for example, Real Housewives of Los Angeles, or the shows that depict really, really super rich women. And this was an online discourse analysis. So I looked at what people were saying about this show online. And I just should have said, I wanted to make sure folks are okay, because the #1 comment was to bring back forced sterilization and eugenics of poor white women. Now, this is a very, very simple research poster about destigmatizing poverty by addressing these social class narrative, colonial capitalist social class narratives in Canada, without having to have paragraphs and paragraphs of explanations. It really gets to the point. Now, this one here is a research poster / infographic, and it's portraying some very complex information. But if you take away all the wording, the visual itself, because most of us know what trickle-down economics are, it really gets to the point of this poverty discrimination in Canada starts at the top and it flows all the way down to Canadian universities. This one, Really Learning with Real, is a research poster for a master's student, and it's really tall. And what's really cool about this research poster is that when you put it on the wall, people were running up and putting their hands on the poster because they thought it was falling off the wall. Just that visceral reaction got people engaged. So using primary colors, because this is about education for K to 12 students. So we wanted those primary colors and to depict building blocks of this learning model that this student developed. And then we took this research poster and it became PowerPoint presentations. It became part of a learning booklet. So many ways that this was used. And what's really exciting, folks, if, for example, this research poster, I turned this into business cards without all that text on, which of course would be minus 1,000 point font. So think about how you can keep the message consistent when you're connecting with folks. Once we start all meeting together in person again, of course, and you need business cards. I couldn't find my business cards forever. So this is a funny story about this research poster. So I hadn't designed print research posters since before COVID, and I kind of forgot how to do it. So I sent this, I was asked to present at a conference at the university I was at. And so I designed the research poster and I sent it to the printers and they contacted me. They said, "Are you sure you want it to be this tall?" And I said, "Well, I can make it a little shorter." And I made it a little shorter. Well, it was 8 feet tall. I hadn't even thought about it. So it actually was from the ceiling and it ran down onto the ground. So here I am presenting research in progress. So lots of times, like in integrating knowledge mobilization, there's nothing perfect about this. So if you're going to do print research posters, you will often find that you can get them printed at your university really inexpensively. So check that out and always be asking your department, "I need support to pay to get this printed." And so this research poster now resides in the faculty at the university that I was at because I don't have any place to put it here. So always ask the question, even if it's uncomfortable to ask. Now, this image that I came across, I have a subscription to Adobe iStock, and this image really depicts the absolute ridiculousness of the colonial and capitalist idea of trying to call that social class ladder, which is fragile at best, as we're learning. And COVID made it very, very clear that the middle class is being pushed down. And it made visible the absolute social class discrimination and fissures in Canadian society. Excuse me. So in this poster, I was depicting the findings, and again, I still wasn't done my research. And what I did was I gave acknowledgement to my research supervisor, Dr. Bud Hall, who came up with the themes in my research for me because I was utterly exhausted and I didn't know how to keep going. Now, this is a research poster. I really want to be able, let me see if I can download this. Nope, clicked on the wrong one, sorry. Let me see if I can, whoops. Okay, so this research poster is a brilliant example of collaboration. So Dr. Bud Hall, who's at the University of Victoria, and he's the UNESCO co-chair in community-based research, and Dr. Leslie Chan, who's from the University of Toronto. We worked a long time together for me to, number one, understand their research and their messaging, and for me to teach them how a research poster should not contain 50 bazillion words. And it was Bud Hall who said, there's a trillion, for people who are from Ontario, there's a trillium, I hope I'm getting the name right, flower with 3 leaves. And both of them explained that the research needed to be grounded in nature. So we came up with 3 points that this research needed to address. And open science is part of open access and decolonizing knowledge. And it was a great learning experience for them as well. When they presented it, there was all these different research posters being presented. And this was in such stark contrast to the traditional overwhelming amount of stuff on research posters. And nothing else is needed. The contact information is there. One of the things that was important for the research, both Leslie and Bud said, absolutely do not say doctor in front of my name. If it's going to be open science and it's going to be open access and it's about decolonizing knowledge, then we have to be accessible and break down those power imbalances that just unnecessarily exist in academia and mobilizing knowledge. So this is the most minimalist research poster, other than the one where the hand is coming out, which I know is really scary. At least this one's not scary. And it also had to be a research poster that could be taken and used by international partners. So if it is heavy with English language, how is somebody, for example, in an African country supposed to be able to use this when English isn't the first language? And this was just truly a delight. And this took us about a month and a half to get this research poster done. Now, this exactly isn't a research poster. See if it'll open. Boy, my internet's slow. So this was a poster to promote research being done by a whole bunch of different researchers under COVID. And this comes to Kimberly's teaching us about how titles need to change. They wanted for the poster it to be something about COVID, but that was a year and a half into COVID and people were tired of hearing the word COVID. So collaborating with Dr. Catherine McGregor from the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria, we came up with Pandemic Storms, Pause, Reflect, and Act. And this had to appeal to people outside of the university as well. And this had real impact. And so there are 4 different images on this page. 5 different images on this page. So I am not a graphic artist, so I have to be very, very clever in what I do. So I took each of these apples, or maybe there's 6 images, more than that, dropped each one of them into a different image of water, placed them on this background, and then put a wave into it. So you can be really creative in what you do. And it's like Kimberly's infographic, where you take whatever you have available to you. You don't have to go spend thousands of dollars to hire a designer to do it. But I really want to reiterate, always be asking your department if they have money to support you. Now, I know that we're at 1:07, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And again, all of this is available online. And you can also see some of the infographics that I have done as well. Okay, I wasn't using Canva, I was using Adobe Illustrator, which of course is not accessible to everyone. But it'll show you that it complements what Kimberly taught us today and how powerful an infographic can be to speak to things that are incredibly complex. So the foundation of Canadian universities, very, very, very historically and contemporary complex topic, but this infographic reduced it to manageable and understandable images just like that. And Leigh, I'm going to stop sharing and mute myself.
Okay, well, again, we have had 3 speakers today, all of which had more to share than the time could allow for, which I think is spectacular. It's disappointing in some respects that we don't have the ample time to go through each and every detail, because these are very engaging topics. But it's rewarding in that each and every speaker has come forward with something so thoughtful and valid that is very clear all of you are very, very passionate about. You'll notice in the chat box that Elaine has made sure that not only are her links available, but also her email. You can see ALABERGE@yorku.ca if you have any questions. And there's definitely to look at her portfolio, which is incredibly professionally done and very thoughtful, very eye-catching as well. Elaine, thank you so much for your sharing what I thought was very, very comprehensive, professional-looking, thoughtful activism. I wish that was an area that I was stronger in. I probably would have been a much more effective activist when it comes to engaging the public and mobilizing knowledge in my own way. So it's always great when we can come together and learn amongst not just ourselves, but be able to, again, disseminate this information with others. The best part about this session today is that it's been recorded. That said, I'm doing a time check here, and it shows that we're only 9 minutes over, I think, what we initially were broadcasting. So I'm going to get to an opportunity, if for those who have indulged thus far, if there are some burning questions that exist, feel free to either unmute yourself and chime in where you see the opportunity to do so, or post them here, and I'll make sure to read them. I'll give a couple of moments. Over the last two speakers, we've gotten two very different but very effective approaches to disseminating information and knowledge mobilization. So if anyone has any questions, the floor is yours. I'll wait a couple of minutes, and if I don't hear any, then we'll start to wrap up.
Would you mind if I asked a question of Elaine, Leigh? I'm sorry, I can't get my chat to work today on this bloody iPad.
Go for it. This is your opportunity, absolutely.
I've been trying to do the research posters a lot the past couple of years, just because I want to master the technique. And I found since the pandemic, I did a conference last year that was university-based. They wanted us to submit the poster, but we also only had a minute because it was going to be an online, and they're keeping it that way this coming year. Only a minute of talk to go along with the video discussion. It wasn't when we had the interchange that you talk about, which is why I value the posters. So I struggle anyways with not having too busy a poster, but I was just going to kind of ask your advice if you've encountered that and how you would kind of go about doing that when you've got a minute max to offer talk and you still don't want to have a busy poster. Any ideas?
Yes, thank you for the question, Linda. And these lightning rapid talks, I just struggle with them. I'm not exactly sure of the point. So design your research poster, and white space should become your friend. And in that 1 minute, Linda, what is the one thing I need to know? Rather than, talking 3,000 miles an hour and trying to cover everything, just that one critical thing. So for example, in my work, if I boil my research down to something, I address poverty discrimination in Canadian universities.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and any support you need, Linda, please let me know. But it's 1 minute is absolutely outrageous. I've probably already been talking for 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. I'm probably going to connect with you for the PhD there, because I know I'm going to have the same problem come March again. But
yeah, no,
we have to have our drops in for January, so I'm struggling now even thinking about it. So, okay, thank you.
But absolutely do contact me, and we'll just say that's part of my job description.
Love it. Okay, I don't see any other comments or questions at this time, so I'll just take this opportunity to once again just quickly summarize that we did learn a lot today, whether it be about activism, artwork, posters, engagement, whether it be about iconography, or whether it be about how to most best represent some lived experience voices through empirical evidence and how that data should be presented. It was a marathon session, a lot of information here, and again, more than maybe we were able to manage in an afternoon. This is the life's work of 3 very intelligent and thoughtful and caring activists. But that said, one of the questions we asked at the beginning was, how do we better disseminate this information? How can we encourage people to engage effectively? How can we create opportunities to, rapidly integrate, knowledge mobilization as a tool for those with lived experience and those who deal with and work with those who do, in the best possible way to create not just spaces for us to learn together, but for us to turn all of this into activism and change thought, change policy, and affect our society. I hope a lot of conversation has come through here that you have found valuable, and I thank you so much to those of you who stuck with us to the end. For those of you that didn't, but were not able to for whatever reason, please remember that there is absolutely a recorded version of this, and that we will make sure that not only is that disseminated through our channels, but we encourage you to share it widely as well, and make sure that people are taking advantage of these tools when they're available, especially if you think there's something that could be very useful to your organization, your activist circle, or some activist who is making a difference in the community who could benefit from this directly. And also to the change makers who many times ignore these pieces. It's great to hear from those with lived experience and hear from those who are doing the work that's right there on the ground. And maybe that can help, encourage them to include us in the future in more than just tokenism. So keeping all that in mind, we talked about how knowledge can be predatory, and the trickle down effect that Elaine mentioned, I think really hits home some of the pieces that were in the beginning of facilitation, which are that, knowledge is power. And that's why I say sometimes it's predatory, and that if you hoard that knowledge and hold on to it and you're not disseminating it, that's a very powerful tool. And that's a lot of leverage that you hold, when it's so much better when we can create open access, non-conformist ideas and share them amongst each other so that we are able to better affect change moving forward for everyone. This type of knowledge not only can make for a more inclusive, comprehensive society, but a safer one for everyone involved as well, that actually celebrates and encourages individualism, but also challenges some of the questions that sometimes remain unanswered. My name is Leigh. I very much enjoyed spending the afternoon with you. I thank all of you who've participated thus far. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you at a future session. Big thank you to everyone involved. Elaine gets a huge thank you, not just for being a facilitator, but also for helping to organize this entire session. She was tremendous from the entire process through, all the way through designing what this looked like, making sure invitations were sent out, and helping me through the facilitation role. And of course, for all of us here, when it comes to making the shift, LivEx and all the different networks that we sort of co-align with and populate, it's wonderful when these type of learning opportunities exist. And I encourage you to participate in future sessions and future webinars of this nature and others when they become available, which should be in very, very short time. Make sure you're checking your local emails. Make sure you're checking up with our website. Make sure that you're continuing to network throughout these partnerships so that we can see all of your lovely faces again and continue to ask the important questions that many times remain unanswered. So have a wonderful afternoon. Wishing you all the best safety. And until we meet again, enjoy your summer.